On the morning of August 3rd, 1915, during World War I, a 21-year-old Russian soldier named Vladimir Kotlinski looked out from behind the huge stone walls of Auschwitz Fortress in Poland. Out in front of him, he saw the same landscape he had been looking at for the last 6 months that he had been stationed at this fortress. It was a big, swampy forest that surrounded them on all sides. Additionally, in this swampy forest around them on all sides were dozens and dozens of trenches. Trenches are long, deep pits that soldiers will dig to both hide inside of when they're being attacked, and then also to launch their own attacks out of from behind their dirt walls. And these trenches that zigged and zagged all around Auschwitz Fortress were created by and now occupied by 7,000 German soldiers. And during World War I, the Russians were fighting the Germans. The Germans really wanted to take Auschwitz Fortress from the Russians. It was in a great strategic position with a railway passing right through it. There was also a river nearby and a main road, meaning whoever owned this fortress was greatly aided in moving critical wartime supplies and troops in a very hotly contested area. But despite the repeated attempts by these 7,000 Germans to take over Auschwitz Fortress over the past 6 months, they had all been repelled by Vladimir and the puny 900-man Russian force inside of the fortress. And so, by that morning, August 3rd, 1915, as Vladimir is looking out from the battlements over the trenches in the marsh down below, it was like both the Russians and the Germans had reached a sort of stalemate, where neither side was trying to attack the other, and neither side was leaving. They were just kind of staying put and doing nothing. In fact, over the last few weeks, there had been so little action from either side that the Russian soldiers inside the fortress got so bored, they began sneaking out the side door of the fortress to try to catch fish with their bare hands in the nearby river. But this morning, as Vladimir stood atop the wall, he noticed something strange happening in one of the trenches that was located closest to the fortress. It was still several hundred feet away, but he could see clearly down into this trench. And what he saw was there was this cluster of high-ranking German officers that were kind of huddled together, and they kept looking down at the ground at something inside of the trench that Vladimir couldn't see, and then they would look up at the sky and kind of wave their hands around, and then they'd look back down at the ground below them. Now, Vladimir had no idea what they were doing. I mean, again, he could not see what they were looking at in the trench, and when he looked up into the sky where they seemed to be looking, it just looked like a regular blue sky. But whatever they were doing, it was making Vladimir feel nervous. Vladimir was a young junior officer, which meant he was in charge of other soldiers, but because he was so new, he lacked experience and credibility, and so really wasn't considered a serious leader within the army. And so, Vladimir, as he's watching this strange behavior, was concerned that if he left now and told his superiors that he was worried about the Germans because they were looking at the sky funny and looking at the ground funny, that it would make him look like he was being paranoid and not a good leader. And so ultimately, Vladimir just looked at this cluster inside of the trench and decided, you know what, they're not shooting at us, there's no attack happening, so whatever they're doing, it can't be that big of a deal, and lately, no one's done anything, so why would that change now? And so Vladimir left the walls of Auschwitz Fortress and went down below to hang out with his friends. 3 days later, at 4 a.m, the Russian soldiers who were up along the Auschwitz Fortress walls keeping watch that night noticed something strange out in the darkness near where the Germans were. When they looked out, they saw that the dark night air almost looked kind of blurry or wavy, kind of like if you were looking at air coming off of hot pavement on a sunny day, it would look kind of blurry. That's what the night sky looked like to them. But of course, it couldn't be because of heat and sun, because it's the morning, it's cold, it's dark outside. And so as these Russians are looking out, not sure what to make of this blurry air, they began calling up more Russians to go have a look and figure out what this was. And over the next couple of minutes, as the Russians looked out from behind the walls at this air, they realized what it was. It was this huge grayish-green cloud that was as wide as the fortress was, and the wind was blowing it in their direction. Now, the Russian soldiers had no idea what this was, and so they just kind of stood there watching it in stunned silence. And as they watched, they saw as the cloud would touch any vegetation like leaves on trees or the high grass in the marsh, it would all turn black and shrivel up. And then the soldiers began hearing a soft thump, 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 thump out in the darkness. And it was the sound of birds dying and falling to the ground that were inside of this cloud. At this point, the Russians began to panic, and they began to run to sound the alarm to get the other soldiers up to prepare for an attack. But as they did, they began to smell this very harsh chemical smell coming into the fortress, and then before long, all the Russians could hear was the sound of their comrades coughing. It would turn out that strange behavior that Vladimir saw 3 days earlier of the German officers huddled together looking at the sky and then looking down at the ground and then back at the sky again. What they were doing was preparing for a chemical attack on Auschwitz Fortress. On the ground, out of sight of Vladimir, were canisters containing the poisonous gas, and when the officers would look up and put their hands up, they were gauging if the wind was strong enough and in the right direction to launch the attack. Now, 3 days ago, the wind had not been in their favor, but this morning at 4 a.m. on August 6th, 1915, the wind had been in their favor, and they had released the gas. And this gas was quite possibly the worst gas you could ever come up against on the battlefield. It was a combination of chlorine gas and bromine gas. On their own, chlorine and bromine are very toxic and can kill you. But when you mix those two gases, it becomes exponentially more dangerous. The gas mixture binds to moisture and then turns the moisture into hydrochloric acid. Meaning, if a person who did not have a gas mask on came in contact with this poisonous gas, when they inhaled it, it would literally fill their lungs with acid, which would dissolve them from the inside out. And then also, the gas would get into their eyes and into their nose, and the acid there would burrow holes into their skull. And once you've come in contact with this gas, there's nothing anybody can do to save you. You're gonna die, except it's gonna take a really, really long time. You don't just immediately dissolve. It's this long, drawn-out, excruciatingly painful process. By this point in World War I, chemical warfare was really not being used by anybody, and so as a result, the Russian army did not outfit their soldiers with gas masks. The German army did, and they knew the Russian army did not. So, as this horrific poisonous gas began permeating every square inch of Auschwitz Fortress, all of these Russian soldiers had nothing they could do to protect themselves from this gas. And so right away, soldiers began bleeding from their eyes and their mouths and their ears, and they literally began coughing up chunks of their lung. And so very quickly, the Russians inside the fortress understood they were being poisoned. And so these soldiers that were not as affected, at least not right away, by this gas, quickly began ripping off their shirts, dunking them in water, and wrapping them around their heads to try to limit how much they breathed in of this chemical. But it really didn't do much to stop the chemical. In fact, these makeshift gas masks might have made it worse because the gas would have bound to the moisture on the shirt. And so the Russians were totally doomed. They were surrounded on all sides outside the walls by their enemy, and then inside the fortress was this gas, and there was no ventilation in the fortress, and so there was nowhere to go. They couldn't escape death no matter where they went. And so Vladimir, he was one of the guys that was still on his feet inside of the fortress, and he stumbled over to this narrow window on the side of the fortress walls, and he looked out and he saw all these Germans running towards them, firing their machine guns, artillery's being fired. I mean, he knows they are moments away from the Germans breaching the fortress door, coming inside, and killing every last one of them. But Vladimir's reaction to this was not being scared or being sad. Instead, he suddenly felt incredibly motivated. If they're going to come in here and kill us, then we're going to make it as hard as humanly possible first. Vladimir had a reputation for being totally fearless. Over the past 6 months that they had been under siege from the German army out in their trenches, anytime fighting broke out, Vladimir was always the first to run up and be right on the front line of fighting. And then several times when his comrades had been shot or wounded, Vladimir would run out into the line of fire to save the fallen soldiers. It was like Vladimir lacked any instinct for self-preservation. And so as the Germans continued their run towards the fortress, artillery shells are hitting the walls, there's constant gunfire, and Vladimir, he leaves his window and he marches back over to the open courtyard inside of this fortress where the 100 or so other still living Russian soldiers were. I mean, they're all gonna die. They've been totally poisoned by this gas, and it's just a matter of time now. But they're still on their feet, and Vladimir walks over to them, and even though, again, he's pretty junior, he stands up and he says to them, "This is our moment. We are all going to die. But what we do right now will define us." And the way Vladimir said it, he got those 100 soldiers who were on death's door to be so motivated so quickly that they rallied to him. And so as these men are literally bleeding out of their eyes, their mouths, they're coughing up pieces of their lung, Vladimir explained the plan. And then moments later, with Vladimir in the front, this gaggle of soon-to-die Russian soldiers charged towards the gates, opened the fortress, and began running out towards the Germans, screaming with their bayonets lowered. Now, the Germans on the outside fully expected that this chemical attack would kill all of the Russians, that taking Auschwitz Fortress would be super routine because when they walked in, everybody would be dead. And so suddenly to have the fortress open and have these men that are covered in bloody rags and they're puking up pieces of their organs and they're stumbling forward like zombies with bayonets out, screaming like banshees, it scared the living out of the Germans. In fact, they were so quickly terrified by what they saw, they literally dropped their guns, turned, and began running back towards their trenches. And as they did, Vladimir and his dead man army began picking off the Germans one by one. And then after Vladimir and the dead man army ran out of ammunition, they just continued staggering forward directly into the thousands of Germans in front of them and began picking up dead German weapons and firing them. And then when they got up to the trenches where these retreating Germans had been so scared they had run into their own barbed wire, and so there's all these retreating Germans stuck on the barbed wire, the Russians just began bayoneting all these men that were stuck. And so at some point, as Vladimir is doing this, a German soldier ran up to him and bayoneted Vladimir right in the stomach. He ran him all the way through until the barrel of the gun was right up against his stomach. And Vladimir apparently looked down at this bayonet, knew he had been completely run through, and he looked up at the German who had just stabbed him, who's still holding the gun, and Vladimir spit blood and lung tissue all over this German's face, and then just began screaming directly at this guy. And so the German was so scared, he just dropped the gun, turned, tried to run, and then Vladimir was back on his gun with the bayonet still in his stomach, shooting at the Germans. The Germans were so completely caught off guard and terrified by Vladimir's dead man army counterattack that even though they outnumbered the Russians 70-1, they failed to take Auschwitz Fortress. The main reason for that was the Germans who had escaped the counterattack and made it back to their trenches. They told the other German soldiers that the Russians had turned into zombies, literally, that they were undead, and so attacking them was pointless. They're already dead. And the Germans were so scared, they refused to leave their trenches again. Once the Russians could tell they had successfully forced a retreat by the German army, Vladimir, who was still alive at this point with a gun still stuck in his gut from the bayonet, he called out to the rest of his soldiers to retreat back to the fortress. And so this handful of Russian soldiers who were about to die, they hobbled their way back inside of their fortress, and then Vladimir gave his final command: destroy the fortress. If we can't have it, nobody can. Every single Russian soldier that came in contact with that poisonous gas died, including Vladimir. When the Germans did eventually take Auschwitz Fortress at a later date, when again, all of the Russians were dead, when the Germans went inside, they realized the fortress had been destroyed and it was no longer strategically valuable. Vladimir would be awarded posthumously Russia's highest military honor. His actions and the actions of the other dying soldiers that fought alongside him are remembered today in stories, songs, and statues all across Russia. On the afternoon of May 25th, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was laying on her couch in her home in Atlanta, Georgia, with an ice pack on her head. She had a blinding headache, one of the worst headaches she had ever had, and she was just unable to do anything else but lay on the couch. Nicole really had no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only thing she could think of was 3 weeks earlier, she had been in a minor car accident and one of her car windows had broken and some of the glass had cut her face, but she didn't think that would be enough to lead to this absolutely horrific headache that had not gone away for 3 weeks. But Nicole was a very tough woman, and even though she had thought about going to the hospital over these past 3 weeks to deal with whatever was causing this headache, she had told herself that, it's got to be something minor. I just need to kind of tough it out here. And what toughing it out looked like was laying on the couch all day long, only getting up to eat and go to the bathroom, not going to work, and just sitting in the darkness with this ice pack, just hoping for this headache to go away. And so as Nicole was just laying there, she heard her back door open up. It was her boyfriend, Durante, coming in with groceries. He came inside and he put the groceries away, and then he came into the living room where she was, and he asked how she was doing. And she told him that the headache had not gone away yet, and would he mind going into the kitchen and getting her some ibuprofen, which are pain meds, as well as some water. And so Durante said, of course. He went in the kitchen, he got what she needed, he brought it back. She said thank you, she took the ibuprofen, and then she went back to just being totally miserable. But just a second later, Nicole and Durante heard a knock at the front door, and Durante, he walked over and kind of casually looked through the blinds to see if he could see who was at the front door, and he saw it was Nicole's best friend, Leisha. But instead of going to the door and opening it, Durante turned to Nicole and said, "Hey, it's Leisha, do you want me to get the door?" And Nicole, she just kind of grunted and said, "No, please just ignore her." Even though Nicole and Leisha were very close, Nicole knew that Leisha was very high energy. She had been calling and texting basically nonstop ever since Nicole had begun getting these headaches. Leisha just wanted to help and kind of be around and be a part of her recovery. But Nicole just couldn't deal with that super high energy right now. She could barely have a conversation without her head hurting even more. And she knew that Leisha and Durante didn't really get along too well, and so Nicole figured it would just be better for everybody if they pretended no one was home and Leisha just went on her merry way. But Leisha was very persistent and just continued knocking really loud on the front door. She began calling Nicole's phone, and so Nicole began reaching over and silencing her phone over and over again. And finally, Nicole looked over at Durante and just said, "I don't need this. I'm going into my bedroom and I'm lying down." And so she grabbed her phone, she stood up off the couch, she could barely move, her head hurt so bad, and she walked, quietly past the front door, made her way into her bedroom, and she was about to lay down on the bed when she made the mistake of opening up her blinds just a little bit. Her room was on the front of the house as well, and she wanted to see if Leisha was still there, and when she opened those blinds, Leisha, who was outside, happened to be looking at Nicole's bedroom, and the two of them made eye contact. And Nicole's like, oh my God, she knows I'm here. And so Nicole, she just shuts the blinds. But now Leisha comes up to the window and she's yelling, "Nicole, I know you're there. Come on, let me in. I want to help you." But Nicole, she just could not deal with it. And so she laid down on her bed and just continued to totally ignore Leisha. Nicole knew that no matter how offended and upset Leisha was for this snub, she would get over it, because the two women had been friends for nearly 2 decades. 19 years earlier, they had been neighbors, and they had become friends really quickly. They had been pregnant at the same time, and they began raising their kids kind of like side by side. But in the last 5 years that Nicole and Durante had been together, Nicole and Leisha had kind of drifted apart, because Leisha and Durante both had very strong personalities and they just kind of clashed. And Nicole and Durante had this kind of on-again, off-again relationship, and every time they were broken up, Leisha would come around and be totally unfiltered with Nicole about how much she didn't like Durante. But right now, Nicole could just not deal with Leisha, and so despite hearing her yelling for her to come outside, "Come on, I know you're in there," Nicole just rolled over on her bed with her ice pack on the side of her head, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, when Nicole woke up, Leisha was gone, as well as Durante. He didn't stick around for very long. He often would only come over just to check in, and then he'd go off and do his own thing. And so Nicole, who still had this blinding headache, she sat up, she got out of her bed, and she was only able to walk back out into the living room, where she laid down on the couch and just went right back to sleep. Even though Nicole had had this headache for 3 weeks and it had not gotten any better, she really was convinced that taking enough ibuprofen and relaxing long enough would cause it to go away. But over the next couple of days, this headache, which was already like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale to Nicole, somehow became like a 20 out of 10, and it got so bad that she couldn't even open her eyes. It was like horrific. And as this headache got so bad, her relationship with Durante started to sour. Durante didn't really believe that Nicole was actually in the amount of pain that she was in, and he kind of began acting like she was just being lazy. And this really upset Nicole, because that wasn't true at all. She was just in blinding pain and couldn't do anything. Finally, in late June, so 5 weeks after Nicole's headaches had begun, and at this point, her headache had still not gone away, she was laying on the couch, like always, with the lights off, she's got the ice pack on her head, and she's just trying to get through the day, when she hears the back door open, and it's Durante. And he comes in, he slams the back door, he doesn't even say hello, and he just storms into the living room and just looks down at her with a totally disapproving look. And Nicole, she kind of looked over at him, and when she saw that look on his face, she had just had it, and she said, "You know what? We're done." And immediately Durante got so mad, and he's like, "How dare you? I've been taking care of you for the past 5 weeks, bringing you groceries, this and that." And Nicole, she had no energy to fight with him, and so she just let him rant and rave until finally he was done, and he walked out, and she was like, thank goodness. A few days later, on June 25th, Leisha was back at Nicole's house, knocking on the door. Nicole had actually texted her to let her know that she had officially ended things with Durante, and so feel free to come over, there's not going to be any drama with him being here. And so Leisha had come back over. She was very excited to see Nicole and kind of get over the snafu of her being ignored. And when she knocked, Nicole did go up to the door and she opened it up. And Leisha, as soon as she saw Nicole, this is like the first time she's seeing her since Nicole's headaches had really begun, she knew something was definitely wrong with Nicole. Her entire apartment is totally dark. All the windows are covered up. And Nicole is squinting out at Leisha, kind of beckoning her to come inside. And Leisha's like, "Oh my gosh, like how bad is this headache?" And Nicole could barely make a sentence, and she just said, "Oh, it's so bad. It's so bad." And so Leisha came inside, and Nicole led her through the dark apartment to the kitchen and back. And Nicole, she sat down, and Leisha sat down opposite her. And Leisha began asking Nicole questions about her headache, about Durante, just kind of about her life. And quickly, Leisha realized that Nicole really wasn't making any sense. Her answers, even to the simplest questions like, "What did you eat today?" were in fragments and didn't really make any sense. And finally, Leisha said to Nicole, "Hey, this can't be a normal headache. This is something serious. You need to go to the hospital." And at this point, even though Nicole had been trying so hard to just kind of white knuckle her way through whatever was going on in hopes it would go away, she was starting to realize that there was something wrong here and she needed help from a doctor. And so Nicole agreed to go. And so Leisha would help Nicole up and kind of assist her out of the apartment and into Leisha's car, and Leisha would take her to the hospital. And when they got there, Leisha brought Nicole into the emergency room, and she explained to the nurses and doctors that Nicole had this terrible migraine. It started after she was in this minor car accident 5 weeks earlier. And so the doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to one of the rooms, and they began kind of treating her the way they would any other patient who had a serious headache. They asked her if she was hydrated. They asked what medication she was taking. They asked her what she was eating, how much sleep she was getting. They were just kind of going down the list of different things that could cause this headache, but nothing stood out as a red flag. Even the fact that she had been in this minor car accident and had some cuts on her face from the glass, that really wasn't enough for them to think, oh yeah, that would cause 5 weeks of a persistent migraine-like headache. They even looked at the cuts on her face to see if maybe they were infected or something, but they weren't. Basically, they had no idea what was causing this. But the doctors and nurses were very concerned because persistent, extreme pain in your head could be signs of a stroke or an aneurysm or something, both of which can be fatal. So they put Nicole through a series of imaging scans to get a look inside of her head to try to figure out what was going on. And after they finished all these scans, Nicole was brought back to her hospital room and she laid down on the bed. And even though she felt terrible still because of this headache, she at least felt like, okay, finally, these people are going to figure out what's wrong with me. They're going to give me medication. This headache's going to go away and I can get back to my normal life. But only a few minutes later, as Nicole is laying there trying to get comfortable, the door to her room suddenly burst open and a swarm of people came into the room looking very concerned. And in the middle of all these people was a guy wearing a suit, and he walked up to Nicole and he said he was a police detective, and he held up one of her scans and he pointed at it. But to understand what he was pointing at on her scan, we need to go back and look at what really happened on the day that Nicole got into that minor car accident. Back in early May of 2017, Nicole and Durante, who were still dating at this point, had just come back to Nicole's house after the two of them had been at a house party together. And Nicole was furious with Durante because at this house party, he had been openly flirting with another woman right in front of Nicole. And so Nicole, after going into her house, brought it up to Durante about how disrespectful that was. And Durante, instead of being apologetic or trying to defend himself or even lie about it, he actually just got really mad at Nicole and said, you know what, fine, I'm breaking up with you. And then he began going around her house, gathering up all of his things that he had left inside of her house. And Nicole, truthfully, was so mad that she didn't really care that he was putting on this show of taking his stuff and leaving her. And so after a few minutes of Durante angrily grabbing his stuff from inside the house, he headed outside to Nicole's car where he had some more things inside of her car. And so he went in the passenger seat, and Nicole, she just reflexively got into the driver's seat of the car just to make sure that Durante didn't take anything inside of her car that he shouldn't, or mess with her car in some way to get revenge on her. And so she's sitting there, she's watching Durante right next to her, gather up his things, and then he hops out of the car, doesn't say a word to her, and then he walked around the front of her car and got into his car, which was parked right in front of hers, facing out towards the road. He climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and then he didn't move. And so Nicole, she's still sitting in her car, looking at Durante, hoping that he's just going to leave now, but he wasn't. And so suddenly feeling so frustrated and mad at him for everything, she turned on her car and drove forward, not fast or anything, and bumped intentionally into the back of Durante's car, and then she backed up to where she had been. And after she did that, she stared angrily at Durante, basically being like, what? Like, I want you to leave. Like, get out of here. And Durante, he was furious. And so he threw his car in reverse and he really hit the gas and rammed into the front of Nicole's car. And in fact, he hit her car so hard that her car lurched backwards and smashed into her fence. Now, Nicole's memory only showed her this exchange. She remembered fighting with Durante, him getting his stuff, and then her bumping into him, and then him really hard smashing into her. And so when she thought about the minor accident she had gotten into, this was it. But what Nicole did not know as she was laying in the hospital bed, as this detective is holding up the scan and pointing at it, is there was actually a whole other series of events that played out after Durante backed into her. After Durante backed into Nicole and she smashed into her fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to Nicole's car, drew a gun, and shot Nicole in the head. That's what happened. This was not a glass cut. This mark on her forehead was where the bullet went into her skull. But obviously, this did not kill Nicole. It knocked her unconscious, and Durante picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house, where he told his mother that, oh, Nicole was drunk and she got into a small accident and, she just needs to rest. And so Durante's mom, believing her son, put some Neosporin on Nicole's entry wound from the gunshot, put a Band-Aid over it, and kind of looked after her for the night. And then when Nicole came to, she had no idea what happened. Her memory only existed up until Durante rammed into her. She didn't remember him getting out and shooting her and all of that. And so when Durante realized that Nicole didn't know he shot her, he just went along with it and said, oh yeah, you got drunk and, we were fighting a little bit and you got into a small accident and I think the glass fell down and cut your head. That's all that happened. and Nicole believed it. It wasn't until Leisha made Nicole go to the hospital 5 weeks later and they scanned her head that they discovered a bullet lodged in her brain. And so the detective came in the room holding up the scan and he pointed to the bright spot on the scan, and that was the bullet. And the doctors and nurses, they told Nicole that we've never seen anything like this, like you should be dead. And also, because this has gone untreated for 5 weeks, your body healed around the bullet. Like we can't even take it out now. Your brain has formed itself around the bullet. And so it will do more damage than good if we try to pull it out. And so Nicole would go on to live her life with this bullet in her head, but she never really fully recovered. As for Durante, the police would very quickly go after him, but he would flee police and evade them for 2 years. And then finally, when they caught up to him, he was hiding in an attic and there was this whole long standoff. But then finally he would surrender himself, and then he would get charged with a host of crimes, many of which he was convicted of. And so ultimately he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At around 9 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, a 31-year-old woman named Corey Richens tucked her 3 young sons into their beds and then headed downstairs to her kitchen inside of her luxurious home in suburban Utah. Once she got down to the kitchen, she yelled out for her husband, whose name was Eric, to come join her in the kitchen. Corey had some big news that she had just learned that day, and now that their kids were all tucked away in their beds and were off to sleep, she and her husband could celebrate this big news and share a drink together. A moment later, Eric walked into the kitchen and Corey grinned at him and handed him his drink and then gestured for them to go upstairs to their bedroom. And so the two of them went upstairs, they sat down on the bed, and then Corey broke the big news. Corey's tiny real estate company had just found out that day that they were very likely going to close on a deal for this gorgeous 20,000 square foot mansion in Utah for $2 million. Now, Corey knew once she bought this property, she could do a couple of renovations to it and then quickly sell it for $3 million, meaning she was about to make a $1 million profit. Corey had been working really hard on her real estate business for years, but this really represented the first big break. She and Eric lived in a very conservative part of Utah where it was kind of expected that someone like Corey would stay home with the kids and be a good housewife, and that would be her life. But Corey didn't really want that. She wanted to have a professional career that was kind of on par with her husband's. Eric ran a very profitable masonry company that allowed the family to take vacations to Mexico and Spain every year, and also to afford their sprawling property at the end of the cul-de-sac. Corey had stayed home when the 3 boys were much younger, but now that they were 5, 7, and 9 years old, they had decided to hire a nanny, which had allowed Corey to finally go out and pursue her professional dreams. And so, totally beaming with pride, Corey sat there on the bed and clinked her husband's glass and went over all the details of this deal and talked about how great their lives were about to become with all this additional income. But fairly quickly, both of them decided they were too tired to stay up and celebrate any longer, especially Eric, who earlier that day had gotten an allergy shot and it had totally knocked him out. He was feeling kind of weak and tired. And so the two of them decided to just go to bed. And so after brushing their teeth and changing, they got into their bed, they turned off the light, and they were about to lay down and go to sleep when they heard their 7-year-old crying in his bedroom. And both parents let out a groan, and then Corey, she stood up, indicating she would handle this because they knew often their 7-year-old would have nightmares, and the only way he would go back to sleep was if his mom laid with him. And so Corey, she kissed Eric, and then as Eric rolled over to go to bed, Corey walked out of the room, she went down the hall, went into her son's bedroom, she got under the covers, and then before long, she and her son had fallen asleep. A few hours later, Corey suddenly sat up inside of her son's bed. It was about 3 a.m., and for a second, she couldn't even figure out where she was. The house was silent, it was totally dark, and she was confused, but then she remembered she had gotten up to tend to her son, and so she checked on her son, she saw he was still sleeping, and so she climbed out of the bed, she tucked him back in, she gave him a kiss, and then she left his room, went down the hall, and went back into her bedroom, where she climbed into her bed. Then she saw that Eric had kicked off all the covers, and he was sleeping on his back. And so Corey laid down on the bed and kind of rolled up right against her husband, and she pulled the covers up over both of them, and then she closed her eyes to go to sleep, But right as she did that, she noticed something very strange. Eric's body felt freezing cold. Corey opened her eyes and sat up in bed. She turned over and kind of pushed Eric to see if he would sit up and figure out why he was so cold. But Eric didn't budge, and when she pushed him, he felt really heavy, like dead weight. And so suddenly starting to panic, Corey yelled Eric's name several times, but Eric didn't budge. And so Corey leapt from the bed, she grabbed her phone, and she dialed 911. And when the dispatcher picked up, Corey was so hysterical as she's looking at her husband lying motionless in his bed that she could barely tell the dispatcher what was going on. But finally, she did get it out to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher said, "Stay calm, the ambulance will be there as soon as we can." And so just moments later, Corey heard the sirens outside, and so she ran downstairs, she flung the door open, and practically cried with relief as the paramedics charged into the house. But when the paramedics got upstairs into the bedroom and they went to go revive Eric, they saw right away it was already too late. Eric was dead. First responders had no idea what killed Eric. He seemed like a really healthy, fit guy who actually just the day before had gone for a casual 8-mile run. And he was also this big outdoorsman, always going on hikes and going on these long hunts. And so the idea that this guy had just suddenly died seemed really suspicious. The police did find a painkiller pill bottle on the bedside table next to Eric's side of the bed. And for a second they thought, well, maybe he overdosed on painkillers. But when they looked at the label on this pill bottle, it was immediately clear that this was a really old pill bottle and almost certainly had been empty for some time. When they asked Corey what she thought might have happened, she was totally in shock, but she did say, I don't know. I have no idea what happened to him. But, the day before, he did get that allergy shot and he had a kind of adverse reaction to it and really wanted to go to bed quite early, which seemed odd. But both Corey and the first responders agreed that it seemed pretty far-fetched that an allergy shot would lead to Eric's death. Suicide was also considered a possibility by first responders, but Eric really didn't have any reason to want to harm himself. He was a very devoted and loving father who adored his sons. He coached all their sports teams and went on all these adventures with them and was always out back kicking a soccer ball around with them. And his business was booming, and he had just learned that night that his wife's business was potentially going to start booming as well. And so ultimately, the police told Corey that we're just going to have to open an investigation and try to figure out what happened, and we'll be in touch. And if you think of anything that might help the investigation, please let us know. And Corey said, of course, I'll tell you, but she really wasn't listening. All she was thinking about was her 3 sons who were still sleeping in their beds and had no idea their dad was now gone. Over the next few weeks, while the family waited for autopsy results, Corey really focused her energy on her 3 boys who were really hit hard by the loss of their dad. Eric had been such a hands-on father that his absence was enormous in these boys' lives. The 5-year-old kept asking, "Where's Dad and when can I see him again?" The older 2 boys, who did sort of understand that their dad was dead, would also ask questions like, well, can Dad still see us or can Dad still hear us? And these questions broke Corey's heart because she did not have an adequate answer to any of them. And so she tried to find a children's book online and in bookstores that dealt with grief in hopes that that would kind of help her sons deal with what they were going through. But none of the books she got helped at all. And so a few weeks after Eric's death, when still nobody knew anything about how Eric died or what had really happened, Corey decided that she would take a different approach to helping her sons grieve. Instead of trying to read a book that somebody else wrote about how to handle grief, Corey just called her sons around one night and began telling them a story about their dad. And as she told them this kind of made-up story about their dad being this angel that was taking care of them, she began drawing pictures with a crayon and paper of their dad with wings and a halo, and she'd draw the kids down below waving up at their dad, and she would tell the boys that your dad is an angel now, and he's looking down on you, and he can hear you, and he loves you. And this really seemed to work for the boys. It was like for the first time since his passing that the boys kind of connected with the fact that their dad was gone, but they still had this meaningful connection with him. And so very quickly, Corey's stories about their dad and the illustrations that would go with them became a ritual. Every night, Corey would tell these stories and draw these pictures. And so as the days and weeks went by, with still no word and no closure about what happened to their dad, Corey had a sort of epiphany. These stories Corey told her kids about their dad and how now he was this angel looking out for them, she could see firsthand how powerful it was and how really it was helping her sons cope with this loss. And she thought, why don't we turn our stories and all these illustrations into an actual grief book for kids? That way other families whose children are dealing with loss can read these stories as well and find some comfort. After all, Corey knew firsthand there really weren't any good grief books on the market. And so she knew for those that needed this, this would be huge. On April 13th, so 6 weeks after Eric had died and several weeks after Corey and her kids had begun officially writing this kid's grief book, Corey was backing out of her driveway when from the other end of the cul-de-sac, she saw a police car coming down the way, and it was the lead detective on Eric's case, Detective Woody. As the detective came down the road, he was waving to Corey, clearly getting her to stop for a second. And so Corey, she parked her car, she hopped outside and went up to talk to him. And immediately, Detective Woody got out of his car, he walked up to Corey, and with a grave look on his face, he told her that he had some big news for her and it was going to be pretty upsetting, but he knew he had to tell her in person and right away. He told her that the autopsy results were in, and they determined that Eric had not died of natural causes. He had actually died from a fentanyl overdose. Fentanyl is a very powerful opioid that's often mixed with heroin, and just a little bit of fentanyl can kill someone. And Eric, it would turn out, had 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. Corey was totally shocked at this news and told the detective that Eric didn't do drugs. The only drug he did was periodically he would eat a marijuana gummy before bed, but that was it. So this really didn't make any sense. The detective was respectful and kind of nodded his head and said, I totally understand that, but these are the results, and we need to find out where he got fentanyl from. And so we're going to need to search all of the electronic devices in your house to see if we can find communication between your husband and whoever got him the fentanyl. Corey told the detective that, of course, they could do that. But as she began thinking about all of their devices, she suddenly remembered that Eric's business partner, Cody Wright, had actually taken Eric's laptop very shortly after Eric had passed away. Now, Corey didn't know why Cody had taken the laptop, but Cody had been a thorn in both Corey and Eric's side for several years now. Eric and Cody had been very close friends when they had started their masonry business together about a decade earlier, but they'd had a serious falling out a few years back. The two men had been on this elk hunting trip, and at one point Eric had illegally shot and killed a bull elk, and Cody had actually reported Eric after this hunting trip to the game wardens. And as a result, Eric got in a lot of trouble and was temporarily banned from hunting anywhere in Utah. The two men still managed to continue to work together and build their masonry business, but it was very clear their relationship was totally fractured and would never be repaired. Now, Corey didn't get into all the details of the tensions with Cody, but she did tell Detective Woody that, if you want access to Eric's laptop, you got to go talk to Cody because he took it for some reason. And also, you really just ought to talk to Cody in general because, maybe he has more to do with what happened to Eric and this whole fentanyl thing than he's letting on. The detective told Corey that he appreciated the information and he appreciated being allowed to go in and collect all the devices, and that he would go talk to Cody and try to retrieve Eric's laptop. And then after that, the detective thanked Corey and said they'd be in touch soon. But after this conversation with Corey, the investigation into Eric's death kind of stalled out. When police did follow up with Cody, they didn't find anything really worth pursuing. And outside of talking to Cody, no new information came in about Eric's death or about, his connection to fentanyl. And so really there was nothing for police to operate on. And so while the family just kind of waited for more information to come out about whatever happened to Eric, Corey just focused her energy on taking care of her 3 boys and writing this grief book with them. And finally, on March 5th, 2023, so almost exactly a year after Eric has died, and still police have no idea what happened to him, the grief book was finally done, and Corey self-published it on Amazon under the title, Are You With Me? And right away, the book was a total hit with parents of grieving children. And as the 5-star reviews poured in, so too did requests from local media for Corey to be interviewed and talk about this book and why she wrote it and how her kids are doing. Corey had no idea her book would be this successful, and so at first she was really terrified to do any of these interviews. But eventually she decided she would just say yes to all the interviews because she was very proud of what her and her kids had created, and she knew Eric would be proud too. However, what Corey didn't know was there was going to be a massive unintended consequence from publishing this book. Ever since Eric was found dead in 2022, the police in Utah began painstakingly searching all of the electronic devices that the Richens owned and that Cody, Eric's business partner, owned. And basically, they were just looking anywhere for some sign of communication between Eric and whoever had given him the lethal fentanyl dose. And at some point during the search of all these devices, the police found something very unusual, and they knew it very likely had to do with Eric's death. But they didn't really have any evidence to prove that, and so they just had to kind of sit on it and wait to see what happened next. And what happened next was shortly after Corey published her grief book, it got all this media attention, and in turn, because of this attention, Eric's death, specifically the unsolved nature of his death, also got a lot of media attention. And eventually, several people who kept seeing all this news about Eric's unsolved death reached out to police and said, you know what? He did not overdose on fentanyl. He was murdered, and I'm almost positive I know who did it. And lo and behold, the alleged killer that all these people brought up to the police was the same person that the police in Utah had become suspicious of because of all those unusual things they had found during their search of all of the electronic devices. And so, on May 8th, 2023, not long after getting all these tips about this alleged killer, the police in Utah felt like they finally had enough ammo to go after this person, and they headed out to make an arrest. While we don't know for sure what happened, because again, this story, it's ongoing. This case has not even gone to trial yet. Here is what prosecutors say really happened to Eric Richens on March 3rd, 2022, the night he died. That night, Eric was upstairs when he heard Corey down in the kitchen calling for him, saying to come down and join her. And so he went downstairs, he went into the kitchen, and immediately he saw his wife grinning ear to ear, and she promptly handed him a drink and said, I have big news and we're going to celebrate. And after the two of them went up to their bedroom, Corey told Eric all about this big real estate deal and how their company was about to profit $1 million. And then after that, they clinked their glasses together, said cheers, and took a sip from their cups. The drink that Corey made for both of them was called a Moscow Mule. It's made with ginger beer, vodka, and lime. But when Corey mixed Eric's Moscow Mule, she added one additional ingredient, a lethal dose of fentanyl. It would turn out Corey had been stealing money from Eric's bank accounts, and he had found out. Eric also had discovered that Corey had been taking out these massive loans in their family's name, which Eric was really upset about. In fact, Eric was so upset with Corey that he wanted a divorce and was talking to a divorce lawyer and making sure after the divorce was finalized that Corey could not touch his money. But perhaps sensing that a divorce was imminent and the money faucet would be turned off, Corey simply took out a $2 million policy on Eric and then killed him. And then shortly after that, in order to help her sons deal with the loss of their father, who she killed, she wrote a grief book about it and sold it for a profit. Police say Corey had been working for weeks to figure out the right fentanyl dose to give to her husband. On Valentine's Day that year, Corey had given Eric a poisoned sandwich that had fentanyl in it that she attached a love note to, but it obviously did not kill Eric. He just broke out in hives. So Corey got a stronger dose of fentanyl. She put it in his drink on March 3rd, and this time it worked. The story that Corey told first responders when they arrived to hopefully try to save Eric was that, they had had this celebratory drink and then they went to bed and then she had gotten up to see her son. And then, when she came back at 3 a.m., Eric was cold to the touch and she called 911. But in reality, after she poisoned her husband and he's laying there still on the bed, slowly dying from this overdose, she just got up and paced around the house for several hours, Googling things like how to destroy electronic evidence and luxury prisons for the rich in America. These searches were, of course, the highly unusual and suspicious things that the police saw when they looked through all those devices during the initial part of the search. But as much as it made them think Corey likely had something to do with this, they didn't have enough to actually arrest her. However, after Corey published her grief book and went on this big tour promoting her grief book, Eric's family, who's watching this happen on TV and listening to the radios, they just couldn't take it. It disgusted them because they secretly believed that Corey had killed Eric over money. They didn't like Corey to begin with, and it just felt like she did this, and now she's profiting on Eric's death. And so family members began reaching out to police in Utah, and they said, you really need to look into Corey. We think she killed Eric. This whole grief book thing is a joke. She's a killer. Ultimately, it was those calls from Eric's family to the police, combined with Corey's very unusual and suspicious search history and electronic activity on the night that Eric died, that allowed police to arrest her at her home on May 8th, 2023. Corey, who denies any wrongdoing and says she did not kill her husband, is currently charged with aggravated murder, which could lead to the death penalty if she's convicted. She's being held without bail while she awaits trial, and her book, Are You With Me?, is no longer being sold on Amazon. On June 8th, 1989, in Pikeville, Kentucky, a young woman stood outside on the second-floor balcony of a motel room, smoking a cigarette and staring down anxiously at the parking lot below. A few minutes later, a little Ford Tempo car pulled into the lot, and the driver got out and started walking towards the first floor of the motel. When the woman saw who the driver was, she instantly flicked her cigarette and began charging down the outside stairs 2 at a time to go cut the driver off. Moments later, the young woman and the driver would be inside of that little Ford Tempo car together, speeding down a dark mountain road, screaming at each other about what the heck they were going to do now. What happened that night, inside of that little car, after the driver had finally pulled over on that dark road, would be so rare and so terrible that the FBI would actually report that it literally, in its entire history, had never seen a case like this before. On the afternoon of May 11th, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was gathering sap inside of a Russian forest with her 82-year-old friend Valia. The two of them had been coming to this grove of birch trees for many years. They enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature, and it was also a good place for Natalia to bring her little dog so he could run around while they collected the sap. It was a perfect spring day. The weather was very mild, the sun was out, and the two friends had a great time just kind of moving around to the different birch trees, using their little drills and hammers to get their taps into the tree, and then they'd put their glass bottles underneath each tap to collect their harvest. And then at some point, Natalia felt like she had all the sap she would need, and she began gathering up her things to get ready to leave. And as she did that, she looked over at Valia, and she had found this really big birch tree, and she had sat down underneath it and was working hard to set her tap. And so as Natalia registered that Valia was over here, kind of doing one more tree before they left, she began looking around for her dog. And she found her dog, and he wasn't too far away from Valia, and he was just kind of moseying around one of the trees, when suddenly Natalia noticed the dog came to a hard stop, and it turned and looked deeper into the forest, like it had clearly registered something that had put it on alert that was out of view. And so Natalia, her view was obscured from whatever the dog was looking at, and so she put down her equipment and kind of moved between the trees to see what her dog was looking at. And at some point, her view cleared, and she saw pretty far off in the forest was something huge, this dark thing kind of moving behind the trees. And suddenly, it jumped out from behind the trees trees and ran towards the dog. It was a huge Russian brown bear. And so totally horrified, Natalia's watching this bear charge her dog. She looks over, she sees Valia, who's pretty hard of hearing, is sitting with her back to this bear and the dog, still just working on this tree. And Natalia's just frozen for a moment, having no idea what to do. And then instinct suddenly took over, and Natalia just turned and began running away, leaving Valia and leaving the dog. But after only running several paces, she stopped and turned around and saw the bear is still trying to attack the dog, but the dog is standing its ground and barking at the bear, which is kind of causing it to back up and be a little unsure of itself, even though this dog is so much smaller. And still Valia is not reacting at all. She has not heard the bear, the dog, nothing. And Natalia, she's looking back knowing that she needs to do something. She can't just let her friend and her dog get killed. And so Natalia began walking slowly back in the direction of this bear, and she began screaming at Valia to get up and run with her. But the second Natalia began screaming, the bear went from looking at the dog to turning and looking at Natalia, and suddenly it was like the dog meant nothing. The bear had decided it was going to go after Natalia. And so Natalia, she's staring at this bear, realizing, oh my God, it's going to charge me. But before she could even turn to run, the bear had ran at full speed and jumped at her. Natalia turned and she tried to run, but the bear bit down on her thigh, and she felt it crush her leg and pull her to the ground and whip her up against a nearby birch tree. And she's screaming and trying to pull herself away, but the bear is ripping at her leg, trying to yank her back into the forest. And then Natalia, she sees her little drill that she uses to set the tap in the trees, and she reaches out and she grabs it, and she turns, and her leg is being actively eaten by this bear. And she turns on the drill, and she's about to jam it into the bear's eye when the bear suddenly stands up to its full height and then just falls all its weight down onto Natalia's chest. And immediately Natalia dropped the drill, and the bear clenched down on her throat. Now, at this point, Valia, who again is hard of hearing, she didn't know what was going on, she turned around and saw this bear mauling her friend. And so what does she do? She runs over to this bear, right behind it, and begins pummeling this bear and screaming at it to get off her friend. And the bear, who barely registers Valia hitting it, it just lets go of Natalia for a second, it turns around, and you gotta remember, this bear has been eating Natalia. Its face is covered in her blood, and it turns and looks at Valia, and Valia, she's terrified, she begins stumbling backwards, and the bear is clearly about to jump on Valia when Natalia, who's barely alive, she sees this happening, and she just begins screaming at this bear while she's laying there bleeding out, trying to attract the bear to come back and keep eating her to spare Valia. And it works. The bear, hearing Natalia screaming behind it, forgets about Valia and turns back around and resumes eating Natalia. And then just seconds later, the bear actually lifted up Natalia by her neck, and it ran off into the woods carrying her. And so Valia is just left watching this happen. She knows she's not going to be able to stop this bear, and so she just begins running back towards the car, which was not that far from where they were. And when she got out there, she grabbed her phone and she called the authorities. About an hour and a half later, hunters sent by the police, along with animal control, arrived at this parking lot, and they found Valia, who was totally in shock, and she would tell the hunters and animal control where this birch tree grove was, where all this happened, and a moment later, the authorities headed into the woods. And after arriving at the birch tree grove, they actually saw the bear. It was by itself, and it turned and looked at them, and it began charging them, and they all raised their rifles, and they fired at the bear. And they shot it enough times that the bear collapsed right in front of them, and then they shot it one more time to make sure the bear was dead. But there was no sign of Natalia anywhere. But then suddenly, the authorities turned and saw something move off in the distance, and out from behind a tree came Natalia's little dog. It had somehow not sustained any injuries from this bear, even though the bear had originally gone after the dog. And the dog, it came up to the authorities and then quickly doubled back behind a tree. And so, kind of operating on instinct, the group followed the dog around the tree, and they saw the dog was closely guarding this kind of mound that was covered in sticks and leaves and dirt. And so one of the hunters walked over and looked down, and they realized there was a person underneath this mound. It was Natalia. They pulled off all of the dirt and the twigs, and they found her absolutely destroyed, mauled body. But Natalia was actually still alive. Brown bears are notorious for eating their prey while they are still alive. And in many cases, they will gravely wound their prey, but not let it die, because then the meat is fresher when they come back and eat it later. And so bears will wound their prey and then basically bury them, cover them up with sticks and dirt, kind of like putting it in the fridge, and then come back and eat them later on. And so Natalia was earmarked to be eaten later because she was still alive and buried. Natalia was rushed out of the forest to a nearby hospital, and she would stay there for several weeks because she had serious injuries from this bear. All over her body were these huge bite marks, and a lot of the flesh from her leg had been pulled off. But amazingly, she would recover, although the trauma of nearly being eaten by a bear has never left her. On September 27th, 2018, in a little city in the Netherlands, a security camera captured 6 men walking calmly toward this brick bungalow inside one of the country's holiday parks. A holiday park is a place that offers cheap accommodations to tourists. They typically have things like campsites, RV parking, cheap bungalows for rent, and they also often offer things like swimming and golfing and bowling, so it's kind of like an all-in-one for families on vacation. But on this September day, these 6 men caught on camera were neither family nor on vacation. Instead, as they walked, it was very clear from their body language that the only thing they were interested in was getting inside of their holiday bungalow. Once they did reach the front door of this bungalow, the apparent leader of the group, who had dark brown hair and a full beard, he pulled out a key, unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he made sure the rest of the men took off their shoes before walking inside. And then once all the men were inside the door, the leader shut the door and locked it behind them. And then barefoot, they walked through the hallway into this corner living room in the back of the bungalow. And in this room, there was this L-shaped couch that was centered on a coffee table and a couple of chairs scattered throughout the rest of the room. And so the 6 men kind of took up seats in these different places. And then after they were all sitting down, 2 of the men who had been seen walking into the bungalow carrying backpacks and duffel bags, they pulled those bags out and set them on the coffee table. And as soon as these 2 men did that, the other 4 men who had been chatting amongst themselves went completely silent and turned and just faced the bags on the table. It was very clear that whatever was in the bags was very significant. So significant, in fact, that the group had pulled most of the curtains across all of the windows inside of this bungalow to make sure no one outside could look in and potentially see the contents of these bags. And once the 2 men unzipped the duffel bags and backpack and began putting the contents of the bags onto the table, it became incredibly clear why the men were so on edge. Inside of these bags were guns, and in the Netherlands, no private citizen is allowed to possess them. Over the next hour, the 2 men who had actually carried the guns into the bungalow, they began going over some instruction with the other 4 men of how to use these slick black pistols and AK-47 rifles. They taught them how to load the guns and reload and how to aim, and they did a number of dry firing exercises, which is basically pulling the trigger on any real gun when the gun is not loaded. And so these 4 students paid careful attention to their 2 instructors, and at some point they became more confident, and you could just see the excitement was building in the room. At one point, one of the students grabbed 2 of the AK-47 rifles and held one in each arm and pretended to fire them simultaneously, like you would see in the Rambo movies. But when one of the 2 instructors reached back into one of these bags and pulled out a new item, a vest, and laid it on the coffee table, immediately the mood in the room shifted again. Now the students seemed more nervous than excited. One of the 4 students eventually walked forward and somewhat reluctantly extended his arm to allow the instructor to slip the vest onto him. And then once the vest was put on the student, you can see in the camera footage, there are pockets all over this vest with little wires poking out of them. This vest was a suicide vest, and the pockets contained explosives. As one of the instructors showed the student in the vest which cord to pull in order to detonate himself, you can hear in the background someone saying, "When the police come, you can take them with you." A little over 2 hours later, these 6 men were done, and they began packing up their arsenal of new weapons back into the bags, and then they stood up to leave. But when they left, it was the students who had the bags of weapons, not the two instructors. Once the 6 men had left the bungalow and were back outside again, they put their shoes back on, they locked the bungalow behind them, and then the 2 instructors were seen on camera walking away from the bungalow to a separate car. They drove off, and then the 4 men that now had the weapons, they walked to a nearby white cargo van, which contained one other man who had not been inside of the bungalow with them, but he was very much a part of this group. He was their driver. And so as the 4 men with guns approached the white van, the driver saw them, he climbed out, he ran around to the back and opened up the back doors that led into the windowless back cargo area of the van. And the 4 men with guns, they climbed inside, the driver shut the van, climbed back into the driver's seat, and then before long, the driver was leaving the parking lot and heading north towards the city of Amsterdam, which is the capital of the Netherlands. Every year, Amsterdam plays host to one of the largest gay pride parades and events in the world. The location is significant to the LGBTQ community because it was here in 2001 that the first gay marriage bill was signed into law, making the Netherlands the first country in the world to legalize gay marriage. So, for 1 week a year, hundreds of thousands of people pour out onto the streets and line the canals of Amsterdam, all drawn together to affirm gay rights and to celebrate their sexual expression, preference, and identity. And the men in the white windowless van intended to use their new weapons and training to kill or maim as many parade goers as possible. They were hopeful that their terrorist attack would rival or even eclipse the attack from 2015 in Paris in a nightclub that killed or injured more than 500 people and sent shockwaves through Europe. 30 minutes later, the 4 men in the back of this windowless van felt the van slow down and pull off the main road and not come to a complete stop, but just kind of begin to slow roll, which was odd because they had no reason to slow down and they were at least 30 minutes away from their destination. And so instinctively, the men reach down and make sure their guns are safely stowed inside of their bags and out of sight in case somebody opens the back door. They don't want people to know they have guns. They are illegal. And so as the van continued to go painfully slowly for really no reason that was clear, the men in the back of the van were really starting to worry that something was wrong. Now remember, they have no windows. They can't look outside. They don't know what's going on. However, there was a small crack in the partition that separated the back of the van from the front of the van where the driver was. And so the men in the back of the van began craning their necks and looking through this little crack to try to see if they could understand what was in front of the van and, why the driver had stopped. And when these men looked through that little crack and they saw what was out there, they immediately began to panic. They began reaching down and fumbling for their bags, trying to open them up to get their guns. And then by the time they're kind of getting the guns into their hands, all the doors on the van fly open and the men in the back just begin firing their guns blindly at the open doors. But when they pull their triggers, nothing happens because their guns were fake. They had been sold to them by the people who were flinging open their doors, the police in tactical gear with their dogs, and they knew these guys had fake guns. They knew their suicide vests were fake. They were full of fake explosives. They have nothing lethal inside of this van. And so the police, they just fling the doors open and send in the dogs. And so the dogs, they jump into this van and these wannabe terrorists are screaming and they're firing their fake guns at the dogs as the dogs are shredding these terrorists to bits. And then whenever they tried to jump out, the police would just pistol whip the terrorists until finally all of these wannabe terrorists were in the fetal position crying, or they were crouched down with their hands over their head. It would turn out the 2 instructors who had brought the duffel bags of guns into the bungalow with the other men, they were not other fellow terrorists. They were undercover police officers who were a part of the special national anti-terrorism team who were able to infiltrate this terrorist cell. These undercover cops were the ones who sold the fake guns and fake explosives to the terrorists, and they were the ones who set up this meeting at the bungalow, which allowed them to place cameras and listening devices all over the place. Plus, they were also able to bug the white van because they knew they would be departing the bungalow inside of it. So all the wannabe terrorists that you saw on camera, plus 2 others that were not seen on camera but were totally involved, were all sentenced on October 8th, 2020 to anywhere from 10 to 17 years in prison. Meanwhile, the Amsterdam Pride Parade went off without a hitch. Carlos Camejo woke up freezing cold and totally confused. It was September 6th, 2007, and all Carlos could remember was being on his motorcycle with the hot sun bearing down on him as he wound his way on his bike through the streets of La Victoria, which is a city in Venezuela. Carlos tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't, and then when he tried to move his body, he couldn't do that either. And so he began to panic because he's paralyzed, but he told himself to calm down. If he couldn't move, at least he could think. He could try to process, what's going on here. There has to be an explanation for it. And so Carlos, in total darkness and immobile, began going through over and over again this whole motorcycle trip, which was his last memory. And he remembered that his friend had called him up and asked him to go out on this ride. Carlos used to go out all the time on his bike for fun with his friends and by himself, but now that he was 33 years old and married, he didn't have the time for it as much. But the weather had been so beautiful that when his friend had called and asked to go out, Carlos said, "Let's do it." And so Carlos began going over in his head the route that they had taken through La Victoria, and all he could remember was this long straightaway and then a right turn, and then nothing. It was like after he made that turn, everything went blank. And as Carlos thought about how weird it was that one, he was paralyzed, and two, he had no memory of what happened after he made that right turn, he started to realize that he felt something against his back. It was like there was a block underneath his back, kind of right between his shoulder blades, propping his chest up, and he felt his arms kind of dangling down by the side, and it was very uncomfortable. And as he laid in this totally awkward position, he began to hear somewhere out in the ether, unfamiliar voices just kind of chatting. And immediately, Carlos is like, okay, someone's here to help me. I don't know what's wrong with me, but somebody's here. I'm going to be okay. And soon, whoever was talking near Carlos had moved closer to him. And actually, Carlos began to realize that it was actually more than one person. It was at least two people talking back and forth. But again, Carlos can't open his eyes. He can't move. He can't communicate with these people. He just knows they've come closer to him. And after these people had moved right up against Carlos suddenly felt something metal pressing up against his chin. And it was kind of sharp and it kind of hurt when it touched his chin. And Carlos wanted to scream out and tell them whatever they were doing to stop and at least tell him what was going on. But Carlos couldn't make a sound. And then Carlos began to hear this kind of mechanical whirring sound, like a machine starting up that was very close to where he was. And suddenly Carlos began panicking, like, what's going on? What are they doing to me? And as Carlos's heart rate is starting to speed up, one of the people who had moved near Carlos suddenly said, "Oh my God, that's impossible. This can't be." And then again, Carlos felt more pain in his chin. And then the pain got dramatically worse. It went from just kind of like a poking feeling to something going into his chin, and he felt it moving underneath his skin like a knife cutting through him. And then whatever it was, it went out of his chin. And as this is happening, Carlos is trying so hard to just wake himself up and do something to tell these people to stop, but he just couldn't do it. And then again, he felt that sharp pain in his chin, another round of something going into him, moving underneath his skin and then poking out again. And the pain became so blinding that suddenly Carlos was able to kind of break through this paralysis and his eyes shot open. And for a second, all Carlos could see was like blinding lights. But then as things came into focus, he saw there were two people, the people who had been speaking, wearing these huge goggles and face masks. And one of them was holding a big needle with black thread attached to it. And that thread was coming from Carlos's chin. They had been running that needle through his face, stitching his chin for some reason, but with no anesthetic. And so as Carlos is staring up at these people in goggles, the people in goggles are looking down at Carlos and they're totally horrified. And they just kind of begin backing up, not really sure what to make of this. And then Carlos, again, kind of breaking through this weird paralysis he was under, he was able to lift his head up and look down at his body. And he saw, to his horror, that he was totally nude. He was laying on a metal table, and there was this Y drawn on his chest, starting at his collarbones, coming down right underneath his throat, and then straight down across his chest. And then after Carlos saw this Y on his naked body, he looked over at a tray that was right next to this metal table near these two guys in goggles who were now kind of backing up, and he saw there was a whirring instrument on this table, and it was a circular blade, a saw. That was the sound he heard. And that's when Carlos figured it out. Earlier that day, when Carlos had been out riding his motorcycle with his friend, he had gone down that long straightaway in La Victoria. He had made a right turn and parked illegally. Right after this turn was this big truck. Carlos didn't see it, and at full speed, he impacted the truck. He was thrown from his bike, smashed into the ground, horrific injuries. And when paramedics showed up, they pronounced him dead on the scene. And so he was moved from the scene of the accident to the morgue. And at the morgue, Carlos was stripped naked and put on this metal table, and they placed a block underneath his shoulders, kind of propping his chest up, and they drew a Y down the center of his chest for his autopsy. The two doctors that Carlos ultimately saw chatting and performing this autopsy were going to follow that Y on his body with the circular saw. That's how they cut you open during an autopsy. But right before they were about to do that, the doctors noticed that Carlos was actively bleeding from his chin. And since he was supposed to be dead, that didn't make any sense. And so that was why one of the doctors had said, "Oh my goodness, this can't be." And so not really sure what to make of it, they had just grabbed a needle and begun stitching his face together to stop the blood from going down his chest. And then Carlos opened his eyes, and it dawned on the two doctors that, oh, he's alive. That's why he's still bleeding. We should definitely take care of him now. But amazingly, after Carlos came back from the dead, he was simply moved into the hallway and left on this metal table, and the doctors who were going to perform his autopsy just left the paper that said he needed an autopsy in his pocket, just kind of showing that, hey, we were just following orders. Somebody told us to give you an autopsy. This is not our fault. And that's where Carlos stayed until his wife showed up and found him in the hallway, just laying there as if he was still just waiting for his autopsy. Carlos would suffer horrible injuries from the accident and serious emotional trauma from almost being cut open during this autopsy, but he would make a full recovery.
Around noon on that same day, so February 8th, 2003, Police Captain Anne Preem was about to go next door and speak to one of Monique's neighbors herself when suddenly a car pulled up at the curb and three men climbed out looking completely shocked and very concerned. By this point, Preem had learned from the neighbors that Monique had a husband and also adult sons, and so Preem assumed that these men must be them. So right away, Preem hurried down the walkway to cut the men off, to keep them from entering the crime scene. And the three men, they just began crowding around her, asking her, like, what's going on? Where's Monique? What's happened? And she told them that, unfortunately, Monique had been stabbed to death. And at first, all three of them just went completely silent. And then one of them, one of the sons, just began to cry. Preem then told them that they couldn't go into the house because it was still an active crime scene. So instead, she led them over to the curb, and they all sat down. Preem could tell the men were in shock, because as much as one man was crying, it just seemed like they couldn't even process what they were told. But it was important to find out what Monique's family knew as soon as possible. So Preem pulled out a notepad and gently asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. The husband, Claude, said that they had all left the house around 3 p.m. the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home alone. They said they had gone to a family gathering near Paris that evening and stayed overnight, and they'd only now just gotten back into town, and they'd seen this whole scene out front, the police tape, and police, they had no idea what was going on. Eventually, Preem asked Claude to tell him all the names of all the people in their family, all their adult children, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everybody. But as Claude was giving this information, he told her that he just couldn't imagine anybody in the family being involved in this. Preem nodded, but she knew that it was entirely possible that family was involved. I mean, unfortunately, this stuff does happen. But she didn't give that off. Instead, she just said, well, can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Monique? And Claude thought about it and just said no. She lived a pretty normal and uneventful life. But then one of the sons piped up and mentioned that actually there might be someone. He said her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed across the street at the house. A minute later, Preem was knocking on the front door of Henri's house. And after a few seconds, a middle-aged man answered the door. And he was very curious about what was going on across the street. And eventually, Preem told him that, well, your neighbor Monique has been murdered. And when she said that, Henri smiled. So immediately, alarm bells are going off in Prim's head. She's thinking this guy is very suspicious. And she asked him, can I come in and look around then? And Henri didn't even seem surprised by this request. It was like he already knew he was going to be looked at as a suspect and said, sure, come on in. So he stepped aside and Prim came in and began searching every room in the house, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she didn't find any traces of blood or really anything else suspicious or unusual. So eventually, Prim made her way back into the living room where Henri was waiting, and she asked him, where were you the previous evening? And he told her very casually that, he and his wife were home. They were here. Prim thought this was a pretty weak alibi, but she made a mental note to follow up with the wife and confirm it later. Next, Prim asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. And Henri said no, except that maybe around 7 p.m., he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. And at this, Prim perked up because the family had told her that Monique had a third adult son named Jean-Luc, who had not gone to that party in Paris. And if Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to see Monique alive. And maybe he was even the killer. The next morning, Prim led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building in a sketchy part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment, and a moment later, a young man answered. After confirming that he was Jean-Luc, 2 officers led him away to be questioned back at the station. Meanwhile, Prim went in with the forensics team to search his apartment. And pretty quickly, as Prim was walking around the living room, one of the other officers called her over to look at something. And so she walked over to him, and she saw he had his flashlight out and he was pointing it at something on the wall. And when she got close enough, she could see that what he was highlighting were what appeared to be tiny drops of blood. And so Prim pulled out her flashlight, and she too began scouring the walls and the floor near the stairs, looking for any more blood. And she found a few more red droplets near the doorknob to a closet. And so she opened the closet up, and inside was a bike. And she shined her flashlight on the bike, on the wheels and the frame, and she saw all these reddish-brown splatters all over the underside of it, as if whoever had ridden this bike last had basically drove through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Prim walked into an interrogation room at the police station where Jean-Luc was sitting with his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and he had this very scared and confused expression on his face. Prim sat down across from him and right away asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc said he had just stopped by after work, as he often did, and he only stayed for maybe half an hour before riding his bike back home. When Prim asked him if he had gone straight home afterwards, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, Christophe Gressier, lived in the same apartment building as they did on the floor right below them. So before going up to his own unit, he said he just stopped by to chat with Christophe for a few minutes, and then after that, he spent the rest of the night in his own apartment with his wife. However, to Prim, she felt like there had to be more to this story because they had found what appeared to be droplets of blood sort of scattered throughout Jean-Luc's apartment, and then, there was blood, or at least what appeared to be blood, on the underside of his bike. And so she figured, maybe if she pushed hard enough, she might be able to get him to change his story. So she told him point blank they had found blood in his living room, and they were now sending it to the lab for analysis. And when Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red, and he began stammering that the blood was very likely from a neighbor who had injured himself while visiting a few days earlier. Prim nodded, but then told him, they'd also found blood sort of all over his bike. And Jean-Luc, he sort of hesitated and stuttered and stammered, but really couldn't come up with any way to explain that. At this point, Prim felt like she had Jean-Luc right where she wanted him. So she just told him to be quiet for a second and just roll up your sleeves so she could look at his arms. Prim knew, based on the defensive wounds on Monique's body, that she likely had fought back really hard, and she must have left at least a few scrapes or bruises on her killer. However, when Jean-Luc finally, rolled up his sleeves, Prim didn't see a single scratch or bruise on his hands or arms. A few minutes later, Prim left the interrogation room and walked to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds, Jean-Luc was definitely still acting suspicious, and she was not ready to let him go. But she also didn't want to get tunnel vision and completely ignore any other suspects, in case the blood inside of Jean-Luc's apartment did turn out to just be a big coincidence. So she sat down at her desk and she opened up a file and she began flipping through the notes of interviews that her team had already done with the rest of Monique's family and her neighbors. Monique's sons had mentioned in their interviews that there was definitely some tension between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had spoken to all the stepdaughters as well as their husbands, and even though some of the women had admitted they still had an issue with Monique, they all had alibis, both the women and their husbands, for the night that Monique was killed. Also, several other family members had mentioned that Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, definitely did not get along with Monique. But officers had tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a very strong suspect. Beatrice had said, for the most part, she and Monique, even if they didn't get along, they just stayed out of each other's way, and that they hadn't seen each other in over a month. And also, Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was barely 4 foot 9 inches tall and 58 years old and just seemed really weak. So it just seemed almost impossible that she could have overpowered the much larger Monique and inflicted the injuries that were inflicted on her and then dragged her out to the front yard. It just seemed sort of impossible. And so, even though she wasn't totally ruled out, for the most part she was. Just then, there was a knock on Preem's door. And when she looked up, she saw there was another officer standing there. And he told her there were 2 people here who wanted to speak to her. Preem nodded, and then a moment later, a very nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman came into the office. They sat down across the desk from Preem, and the man said they had information that could help with the Monique Lejeune investigation. Preem sat up and grabbed a notepad and said, "Okay, tell me what you got." And she began writing as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Gressier. And Preem immediately recognized that that was the name of Jean-Luc's brother-in-law, the one Jean-Luc said he had visited on the night Monique was killed. That was the person he saw apparently right after he left Monique's house. The man sitting across from Preem said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a call from Christophe's number. But when he answered it, all he could hear was a sort of muffled conversation between 2 women. And at first, this man thought what he was hearing was just an accidental call, maybe by Christophe's kid who was just pressing buttons at random. However, the man said when he put his phone on speaker, he and his wife, who was the woman he was with, they both started listening really closely, and they were able to make out a snippet of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi and saying something about a man named Jean-Luc. First, the women had said something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then the women had mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Preem couldn't believe what she was hearing. I mean, any doubts that she had had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much disappeared. And so she took down the couple's names and contact info, showed them out of her office, and then once they were gone, she grabbed her keys and she headed out to go to Christophe's apartment. Now, by this point, Christophe had already been taken into custody and questioned, and he had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the phone call that was apparently made from his number. But Preem hoped that maybe a search of his apartment would tell a different story. She walked through each room of the apartment until she found the washing machine. And there, she put on a pair of latex gloves, and she reached inside the washing machine, and she pulled out a pair of pants that were still damp, as if they had just been washed earlier that day. And she held these pants up and kind of put them in the light, and she could see clearly there was a brownish stain on them. She also noticed that these pants looked like they'd be way too small for Christophe, who was a pretty tall and burly guy. But they definitely looked like they would fit a guy like Jean-Luc, who was much smaller. Later that same day, so this is on February 10th, 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain Preem was in her office when her phone rang. She answered it, and it was a technician from the crime lab telling her they actually already had the results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. And so Preem, she's geared up, ready to hear some potentially, case-breaking news. But the tech told her that the stains that were on the bike, it was blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood that were in Jean-Luc's apartment, like on the walls and near the door handle of the closet, it was blood, but not a match for Monique's. And then also those pants that had been found, that stain on the pants, that wasn't blood at all. That stain was just grease. Preem was very frustrated because in her mind, She had sort of zeroed in on Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now they really had no physical evidence against him. And as for that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, they really had no way of knowing who those two women in the background were, or even if the coworker and his wife had actually overheard the conversation correctly, about the alibi and about Jean-Luc being depressed. Who knows if they actually heard that. So Prem thanked the lab technician for calling with the update, despite how disappointing it was. And she was about to hang up when he told her to wait, because he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had actually found DNA under Monique's fingernails, and it was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least another few weeks to analyze it, but once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects, and maybe it would be a match. This definitely gave Prem some hope. And after she hung up, she began making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from so they could test against it. She definitely knew she would need one from Jean-Luc and Christophe, and then also that neighbor Henri seemed like a strong suspect too. Prem had actually spoken to Henri's wife and confirmed that, at least according to her, they were together that whole night Monique was killed. But she also knew that spouses were very likely to lie for each other, so it was a flimsy alibi. So at this point, Prem felt like she definitely had 3 good potential suspects to get DNA from. But realistically, that was where her list ended. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out by this point, and none of the other neighbors really seemed like suspects. And by all accounts, Monique lived a pretty quiet suburban life and just didn't really get into trouble with anyone, so there really was no one else. And so to Prem, it just felt like something was missing here. Like, in the time I have between now and when the analysis is done on that DNA underneath Monique's fingernails, I need to see if there's something I've missed. And so over the next few weeks, that's what Prem did. She pored over all the evidence they'd collected, and she re-interviewed all the family members and spoke to all the neighbors. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up that brought any other suspects into view. However, at the same time, this is early March by this point, maybe 3-4 weeks after the tech had said they would test this DNA, Prem got another call from the crime lab, and the technician said that the DNA analysis had come back. And even before they tested it against any specific suspects, the results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Prem heard what the tech had to say about the analysis so far, she realized that this was, in fact, the missing piece of information that she needed. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and also an eventual confession by the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Lejeune on the night of February 7th, 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, the door opened and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting the killer inside, Monique just kind of crossed her arms and stared. At this point, the killer began to speak. However, what was supposed to be a polite conversation quickly escalated into an argument, with both of them hurling insults back and forth. And then at some point, Monique slammed the door in the killer's face. But before she did, she said one last thing that was apparently so inflammatory that it pushed the killer over the edge. And so without even stopping to consider what they were doing, the killer, after having the door slammed in their face and hearing this totally inflammatory line, they stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby, and they grabbed the knife they kept under their seat for self-defense. And they carried that knife right back to the front door and knocked again. And as soon as the door opened, the killer pushed their way inside, and with a surge of rage, they just started stabbing. But Monique was very strong and big, and she knocked the killer to the ground and actually pinned them there. But the killer managed to wrestle their arm free that was holding the knife, and they kept stabbing Monique over and over and over again. But Monique, she kept fighting back. I mean, this was an epic struggle. And also, the whole time this is happening, Monique's 4 dogs have basically come over to the gate, which butted up against the entryway, and they're watching this happen. And they're barking like mad, and Monique is screaming out in rage and panic and pain. And the killer is just stabbing and stabbing and stabbing until finally they were able to break away from Monique, who kind of had them pinned, despite, getting stabbed repeatedly. And then once the killer was free, they turned and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, got in their vehicle, began pulling away, and as they did that, they saw Monique stumble out the front door covered in blood. She took a few steps down the walkway and collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was really dead. Instead, they sped away. And then they stopped at a supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, in a trash can. And then the killer went home, and they burned their bloodstained clothes in their stove. They thought that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this crime, especially considering the fact that they knew they were like the last person anybody would suspect of such a horrible, violent murder. It would turn out the killer was the 4-foot 9-inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 58-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally, bury the hatchet after years of feuding between the two sides of Claude's family. But she said the bad blood ran way too deep, and when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the last inflammatory line as she shut the door, Beatrice said she snapped. Beatrice had actually been ruled out as a suspect primarily because she was really, really small, like too small to have overpowered Monique and then to have potentially moved her body out to the front yard. But it would turn out Monique's body was not moved at all. She stumbled out herself. Monique was apparently so full of adrenaline after getting attacked that she had managed to, chase Beatrice out of the house before she collapsed and died. And keep in mind, she did that after being stabbed over 50 times and losing an immense amount of blood inside. And because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to get traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. And so right away, the DNA analysis showed that their killer was a woman. And further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. Investigators never figured out who made that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, but their best guess was that the women that were heard on the phone call were Christophe's mother and sister. And it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker misinterpreted. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on March 29, 2003, and she confessed to the murder immediately, although she later recanted the confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in jail.
52-year-old Fred Jablin watched with pride as his 3 children filed ahead of him into Temple Beth Ahaba's Friday evening service. The night, October 29, 2004, was cloudy and cool, and in Richmond, the capital city of Virginia, the maples and oak trees were still decked out with red and gold fall foliage. Even in the twilight darkness, the autumn colors glowed around the synagogue, the oldest Jewish house of worship in the city of almost 200,000 residents. Just the sight of Beth Ahaba and the graceful columns that fronted the stone and brick building always made Fred feel better, a little less anxious and a little less worried. And every time he walked past the familiar plaque outside the temple and read the words, quote, "What doth the Lord require of thee? Justice, mercy, humility," Fred reminded himself that those 3 qualities had already helped him get through the worst years of his life. And he believed now that those same 3 qualities, justice, mercy, humility, would help guide him and his son and 2 daughters into a happier future. As the Jablins took their usual seats and exchanged quiet greetings with friends and acquaintances, Fred did what he always did. He made a point of reflecting on just how important religion, community, friendship, and the support of his colleagues at work were to his life and his family. And the power of gratitude was just one of the very hard lessons Fred had learned during the last 5 years, when the cracks in his marriage of almost 2 decades had become too deep to patch up. As a well-known and highly regarded college professor who had been one of the early pioneers in the field of organizational communication, Fred had truly believed 5 years ago, back in 1999, that he and his ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, could work together to resolve their differences. But that was before he had found out about his wife's affair with a local doctor. And while that affair was the tipping point for Fred's decision to file for divorce the next year, in March of 2001, that affair had really just been the final betrayal in a series of events that still had the power to shock him, even now, 2 years after he and Piper had officially ended their marriage. As Fred settled into his seat and prepared for the Shabbat, the service that would celebrate God's creation of the world and mark the beginning of a 24-hour period of rest and reflection, he thought how close he had come to losing his job and to losing the trust and respect of his neighbors and coworkers. In the terrible lead-up to the divorce, Piper's behavior had become more and more erratic. The medications she was taking for depression and attention deficit disorder did not seem to be enough to stabilize her moods or decrease her sense of anxiety or discontent. But it wasn't until Piper began calling police and reporting that Fred was physically abusing her and accusing him of trying to drug her that Fred had finally understood just how broken their relationship really was. By then, they had already tried marriage counseling, and Piper had moved out of their family house several times to stay with her best friend in Richmond. But even then, somehow Piper and Fred had still managed to limp along, despite the difficulty Piper had in holding a job, despite the fact that she had a law degree, and her increasing unreliability in caring for the kids, even after she chose to stay at home rather than work outside of the house. But then came the afternoon 4 years ago when police arrived at the University of Richmond where Fred had a tenured teaching position. Earlier that day, Piper had gone to the Henrico County Magistrate's office and sworn out an arrest warrant and restraining order against her husband. Of course, it hadn't always been that way. Back when Fred, an up-and-coming professor, and Piper, a student in her final year, met back in 1981 at the University of Texas in Austin, they seemed to have exactly nothing in common. And when Fred, who was 8 years older than Piper, first met Piper through another professor, Fred did not even recognize her as one of the many students who had attended one of Fred's classes the year before. While 21-year-old Piper was one of 5 children from an old Texas family that had lived in Harlingen, a small town just 30 miles north of the Mexico border, 29-year-old Fred was one of 2 brothers who were born and raised in a mostly Jewish working-class neighborhood just 20 miles east of New York City. While Piper was hands down beautiful with her dark hair and dark eyes and petite but athletic build, Fred was thin and balding and completely average looking, except for the intelligent eyes and the playful grin that clued people in to his wry and entertaining sense of humor. And their outlook on the world turned out to be just as different as their appearances. Fred was a great believer in rational thinking, and where he viewed the world in terms of black and white and took great comfort in set routines, Piper was a free spirit who loved to paint and who would, over time, fill the couple's house with adopted and rescued animals, from birds to a pet ferret. But 2 years after their first meeting, Fred and Piper were married, and over the next 6 years, Piper would eventually get her law degree, cycle in and out of 2 jobs, and then give birth to their oldest child, their daughter Jocelyn. Their son Paxton would arrive 3 years later, and their youngest, Callie, would arrive 3 years after that. And for a long time, it seemed like Fred and Piper's differences actually brought out the best in each of them. Fred became less rigid in his thinking, and Piper seemed to blossom in the light of Fred's affection and devotion to her and the children. But over time, the charm of their opposite personalities seemed to wear very thin. Fred was never a big fan of Piper's family and took to skipping Piper's family reunions. For her part, Piper didn't really connect with Fred's family either, and when his parents died, she opted not to go to either of their funerals. But when Fred got the job offer from the University of Richmond, which came with a $30,000 a year bump in pay, both Piper and Fred agreed that, financially at least, the move from Texas to Virginia made all kinds of sense for their family. The extra money meant that Piper did not have to worry about working if she didn't want to, and she could hire a cleaning service to take care of the house, along with a nanny who could help with the kids. And at first, Fred was sure that the move had given all of them a fresh start. But by 1995, 12 years after they had gotten married, and just 1 year after their move from Texas to Virginia, Fred and Piper were seeing a marriage counselor. Piper was just not able to pass the Virginia bar exam. That's the test that would have allowed her to practice law in Virginia. And even though she had been reluctant to leave her close-knit family in Texas, Piper was not prepared for just how much she missed her mother and siblings. Particularly her older sister Tina, who had always been available to help babysit the kids and to take Piper's side in any of the complaints Piper had about Fred. Prone to postpartum depression, the arrival of the Roundtree Jablin's third baby a year after the move to Virginia seemed to send Piper into a tailspin. But even therapy, both marriage counseling and private therapy with a psychiatrist, did not stop Piper from racking up nearly $52,000 in credit card debt any more than it would reverse the couple's slide into divorce a few years later. But still, nothing in those rocky years could have prepared Fred for that afternoon when Piper had orchestrated his arrest on that charge of domestic violence. Even now, sitting inside the place of worship he had returned to after the divorce, Fred could feel the shame and stunned surprise he felt as he left his office under police escort, hearing the whispers of students and seeing the shock on the faces of his colleagues. But maybe that was exactly what Fred had needed in order to accept that he and his children were probably better off without Piper. So, immediately after being released from the police station that day, Fred had obeyed the terms of the restraining order and kept his distance from Piper by moving into a motel not far from Richmond University, but he also wasted no time in hiring an attorney, and 1 month later, Fred appeared in juvenile court and argued successfully that the Roundtree Jablin children were not safe with Piper. And when the judge examined the evidence of Piper's erratic behavior, the times when she had simply forgotten to pick the children up from school or other activities, and the complete lack of evidence that Piper was a victim of domestic violence, the judge granted Fred temporary custody of Jocelyn, Paxton, and Callie. Until that moment, Fred had believed that the love he and Piper shared for their 3 kids might be enough of a foundation for them to have a civil divorce. Instead, the children became the battlefield for a bitter custody fight. In the end, the court had not believed any of Piper's charges of abuse, and when Fred had filed for divorce, he did so on the grounds that Piper had been unfaithful. He had cited Piper's affair with their oldest daughter's doctor, although it would turn out that there had been other men too, maybe even going back to the mid-1990s. And there was nothing quick or easy about how they reached a settlement. Piper had repeatedly asked for delays in the divorce proceedings until finally, in 2002, almost a year to the date after Fred had filed for the divorce, when Piper did not show up for a hearing on finances and custody, the judge went ahead and made a final ruling without her. And that ruling would turn out to be absolutely devastating for the one-time stay-at-home mom, because on all fronts, Piper would wind up losing. According to that judgment, Fred, whose money had been used to purchase their house in Texas and their house in Virginia, and whose retirement account was much larger than Piper's, would get nearly all the couple's property and liquid assets. But it was the judgment on custody that would completely sever the bond between the parents, because when Fred would eventually press for full legal and physical custody, the court sided with him. That meant that Piper would need to go through Fred to make any and all arrangements to visit their 3 kids. And as far as support payments went, citing Piper's potential as an attorney to out-earn Fred's own salary as a professor, the court also agreed that Fred no longer needed to pay Piper support money, and that going forward, it was Piper who would need to get a job and pay Fred $890 in child support every month. Fred had had no illusions that Piper would actually make those payments, at least not on a monthly basis. And he was right. Piper had tried twice to declare bankruptcy as a way of setting aside the whole divorce decree until a federal bankruptcy court actually prevented her from filing a 3rd time. But Piper's new financial obligations did mean that in order to practice law, she would need to move 1,200 miles away back to Texas, where she had passed that state's bar exam and could practice law. But even though Piper had been the loser in the battle over custody, she had found ways to strike back at Fred. And when it came to revenge, Piper had a lot of help from her sister Tina. And just thinking of Tina made Fred's body tense. Immediately following the court ruling on child support and custody, Tina had written a 43-page so-called psychological profile of Fred. A nurse practitioner who ran her own women's healthcare clinic, Tina was not a licensed mental health professional. But that did not stop her from attacking every aspect of Fred's character, personality, and temperament. In the report, Tina accused Fred of physical and sexual assault, drug abuse, and various personality disorders. She also warned parents that any child or minor that Fred had contact with was at risk of being psychologically abused. Describing the report as a, quote, court document, so it sounded very official, Piper then emailed her sister's denunciation of Fred to his coworkers and university administration, as well as to members of the Parent-Teachers Association at the schools the children all went to, and to the leaders of the scout clubs the kids attended, and to the list of friends and acquaintances Fred and Piper had once shared. During that especially dark period, when the divorce and the pain was so raw that Fred questioned if life could ever seem normal again, he had wondered who hated him more, his ex-wife Piper or his ex-sister-in-law Tina. Just the thought of that question made Fred doubly relieved that he had changed his will just this last year so that in the event of his death, custody of his kids, along with the control over the financial assets his kids would inherit, would go to his brother, Michael, who lived with his wife and their 2 kids in Northern Virginia. Fred had also installed a home security system just in case. He'd never forgotten the time when Piper had taken their youngest child and disappeared without telling Fred, only to turn up in Texas at her sister Tina's with a story of how Fred had started trying to drug Piper. In fact, it had been the other way around. After Fred and Piper split, Fred had learned from a neighbor that Piper had confessed to spiking Fred's morning coffee with the antidepressant Prozac. Fred was suddenly brought back to the present by a gentle nudge from his 15-year-old daughter, Jocelyn, and he realized with a start that he had spent the last several minutes just going through the motions of the Friday evening service. He thought again of the plaque outside the temple, that what the Lord asked of him was justice, mercy, and humility. Fred was self-aware enough to know that when he and Piper divorced 2 years ago, he was thinking more of justice than he was of mercy or humility. But now, 2 years after the divorce agreement was signed, it seemed like both he and Piper had reached a much better place, both as a divorced couple and as individuals. It had taken Fred a while, but he had grown into his all-consuming role as single dad, and all 3 kids were doing exceptionally well. He loved taking the kids to their after-school and summer activities. They had become close to their uncle, Fred's brother Michael, and just 5 months earlier, Fred had ventured out into the dating world and had begun a promising relationship with another single parent, a down-to-earth woman named Charlene. As for Piper, she had begun dating soon after returning to Texas, where she now lived in Houston, very close to her sister Tina. Piper had her own small law practice, but made most of her income doing research into land titles. It was steady work that did not require a law degree, and it paid well enough that she had been able to afford a house of her own, a new black Liberty Jeep, and a lifestyle that seemed comfortable and secure. Even though Piper was often behind on child support, Fred was accommodating about any plans Piper could make to see their kids. In fact, just a few weeks earlier, Piper had come east and taken all 3 kids on a long weekend camping trip in one of Virginia's beautiful national forests. And even though her in-person visits with the kids were not as long or as many as Piper wanted, it wasn't unusual for her to call the kids more than once a day. Maybe, Fred thought as he gave Jocelyn a nudge back to show her he was paying attention again, maybe he and Piper both were ready to practice mercy and humility. Back at the Jablin house on Hearthglow Lane, Fred pulled into the driveway of the detached 2-car garage. A moment later, the children piled out of the Ford Explorer and made their way inside the handsome brick and wood 2-story house set on a slight rise and surrounded by stately trees. Halloween had always been Fred's favorite holiday, and he and the kids had bagged up most of the fallen leaves and stuffed them into leaf bags that were the shape and color of carved orange pumpkins. Throughout the quiet and affluent subdivision, with its neat green and white welcome sign that read Kingsley, homemade scarecrows and ghosts made out of white sheets watched over the comfortable homes, all set back from the road, some with living rooms and kitchen lights shining through the windows. Once inside 1515 Hearthglow Lane, Fred wasted no time shepherding the 3 children off to bed. It was around 10 p.m. when he had said his final goodnight and headed back downstairs to clean up and give Charlene a call before heading to bed himself. By the time Fred had switched off his bedside light and settled down to sleep, the painful memories of the past had been replaced with a sense of pleasant anticipation for the weekend ahead. Tomorrow was Saturday, and while the children slept in, Fred would enjoy his coffee and newspaper, and after that, all four of them would have a busy day, going to the annual neighborhood pumpkin festival, spending time together and with friends, and putting the finishing touches on their costumes. And on Sunday, they would all enjoy the kind of safe scares that came with going door to door trick-or-treating. At 6:37 a.m. the next morning, Fred Jablin's next-door neighbors awoke from a deep sleep to the sudden sound of 3 gunshots. Getting out of bed and stepping to the open window, former Marine Bob McCardle pushed aside the curtain and saw a shadowy figure running across his front yard and then disappearing into neighboring house lots. While dogs began barking and other neighbors were wondering if a car had backfired or if a hunter was shooting ducks down on Tuckahoe Creek, Bob immediately picked up the phone and called 911. Within minutes of the call, 3 officers from Henrico County Police Department were climbing out of the patrol car in front of the McCardle home. Spreading out across the lawns of Hearthglow Lane, they used flashlights to search in the darkness for the source of the disturbance. But after 20 minutes, the officers reported back to Bob that they had not found anything suspicious. Bob told them that once it was light, he and his wife would take their dog out for a walk, and if they saw anything that could explain the shots, they would follow up with another call to police. 25 minutes later, it was Doreen McCardle who called 911. Trying her best to keep the panic out of her voice, she explained to dispatch that she, her husband Bob, and their dog were now standing outside of their neighbor's house at 1515 Hearthglow Lane, and Bob had just discovered the body of Fred Jablin. The single dad and prominent Richmond University professor was lying in his driveway alongside the family car, his body stretched out on a thin carpet of blood-soaked leaves. This time, Henrico police responded with a flood of emergency and medical personnel, and within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was alive with flashing lights and sirens. But their response was too late. Fred Jablin was dead. Even as officers strung yellow crime scene tape around the half-acre lot of the Jablin home, a SWAT team had entered the house to make sure the murderer was not inside, and if necessary, to rescue the 3 sleeping children. But the house was empty except for Fred's kids. As Jocelyn was escorted out the back door so she would not see her father's body lying in the driveway, the 15-year-old turned to the police officer at her side, and she asked him to please make sure her brother, sister, and father got out. By 8:30 a.m. that Saturday morning, Henrico County homicide investigator Kobe Kelly had arrived on the scene and pushed the investigation into high gear. A 4-year veteran of the police force, the 6'2" detective was just 32 years old, but he had a well-deserved reputation for professionalism and for getting results. The Roundtree Jablin children were quickly sheltered at the home of a local police officer who knew the Jablins and lived in the same area. A special victims unit was on its way to help break the terrible news of their father's death and to find out what the children may have heard or seen that morning. Detective Kelly's initial examination of both the outside crime scene and the inside of the house showed no evidence that this had been a robbery gone wrong. There was no sign that anything had been taken. And unfortunately, the neighbor who had made the 911 call to police after hearing gunshots and seeing a figure run across his front lawn could not even identify whether that person had been a man or a woman. Hopefully, the crime scene techs, who were already there collecting any physical evidence and dusting for fingerprints, would be able to provide more information. But at first glance, it looked to Kelly like this had been a premeditated crime, planned by someone who must have known Fred Jablin's morning routine well enough to be lying in wait for him when he stepped outside in the dark that morning to pick up the newspaper that had been tossed onto his driveway. But even before Kelly heard back from the officers he'd sent out to knock on doors and collect information and search for the murder weapon, Kelly knew that there would be plenty of suspects in this case. The victim had been a high-profile college professor with a reputation for working closely with students, any one of whom might have harbored a grudge related to perhaps a failed thesis or maybe a bad grade. With that in mind, Detective Kelly also sent a team out to the University of Richmond, 6 miles east, to treat Fred's personal office as a crime scene and to interview faculty and students. The detective also started the process of obtaining search warrants, putting in a subpoena for any relevant phone records. But even as the investigator watched a crime scene tech carefully bag a copper-jacketed hollow-point bullet they'd found to the right of the body, Detective Kelly already had the name of the person he was most interested in talking to. In any homicide investigation, the most likely suspects are those with the closest and most intense relationships to the victim. And even though Fred Jablin's ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, lived 1,200 miles to the west in Houston, Texas, she was still number one on Detective Kelly's suspect list, especially when he heard from the first officers on the scene that Fred and Piper had gone through a very messy divorce just 2 years earlier, and that custody of the 3 kids was still an ongoing issue. By 10 a.m. that morning, the oldest of the Roundtree-Jablin children had told police that she had heard a gunshot early that morning but had gone back to sleep. The younger 2 kids both told police that they had each had separate phone conversations with their mom the afternoon and evening before. She told them she was calling from Galveston, Texas, where she was researching a land title. She'd also told 12-year-old Paxton about a raccoon that was living under the porch of her house. Knowing that the first 48 hours of any investigation are often the most crucial, Detective Kelly was determined to check out every possible lead. And even though Piper had told her children she had called last night from Texas, Detective Kelly still ordered investigators to check for any passengers named Piper Roundtree who may have flown into Richmond from Houston, Texas over the last several days. By 2:30 p.m., Michael Jablin had been informed of his brother's death, and he and his wife were in their car traveling south to Richmond. And by 3:30 p.m., just 8 hours after the McCardles had discovered Fred's body and made their second 911 call, Detective Kelly had already caught a major break in the investigation. His investigators had in fact discovered that a passenger by the name of Roundtree had flown out of Virginia's Norfolk Airport just 3 hours earlier on a Southwest Airlines flight that was due to arrive back in Houston's Hobby Airport at 4:30 Houston time, which meant 5:30 Virginia time. But there was one problem. The passenger's first name was not Piper. Instead, it was a name Detective Kelly had not yet heard: Tina. Detective Kelly had already found a good picture of Piper Roundtree in one of her children's bedrooms, and the driver's license picture on file for the plane ticket his investigators had discovered was definitely a different person. Instead of dark brown hair, Tina Roundtree had shoulder-length blonde hair. Glancing at his watch and seeing he had 2 hours before the plane carrying Tina Roundtree was due to arrive at Hobby Airport in Houston, Detective Kelly rolled into action. Contacting police in Houston, he sent them pictures of both Piper and Tina Roundtree and asked them if they would go to Hobby Airport in time to locate a passenger getting off that Southwest Airlines flight who looked like either of the 2 women. But it would turn out that Detective Kelly was now in for a series of disappointments. Whoever that passenger named Tina Roundtree was, she had managed to disembark, collect her checked bags, and apparently leave the airport in Houston without being intercepted or recognized by Houston police. And when Officer Kelly finally reached Piper Roundtree by phone in Houston that night at 9 p.m., 14 hours after Fred had been declared dead, it would turn out that Piper Roundtree would have a rock-solid alibi for the time of the murder. And after being informed by a friend in Richmond about Fred's murder that morning, the only thing Piper wanted to talk about now was where her children were, who was taking care of them, and how they were coping with this devastating news. By now, Detective Kelly had also been filled in on the identity of Tina Roundtree, Piper's older sister, who also lived in Houston. Realizing that he would need to conduct this investigation in 2 different states, Detective Kelly and his partner headed to Houston to interview the Roundtree sisters. Before leaving, the lead investigator assigned Detective Chuck Hanna and one other investigator to follow up on leads in Richmond. At Detective Kelly's first official interview with Piper on Sunday, October 31st, Fred's ex-wife denied any involvement in Fred's murder. And not only would a friend of hers, who was also a lawyer, place Piper in his office before that Southwest flight ever arrived back in Houston on Saturday, October 30th, the day Fred was killed, Piper would also be able to locate someone who could provide further confirmation of her alibi, a stranger who had seen her at a local bar in Houston on Friday night, when the passenger flying under the name Tina Roundtree had already landed 1,200 miles away in Richmond, Virginia. As for Piper's sister, Tina Roundtree, where Piper had reacted to the news of Fred's death by wanting to talk about when she could see her kids again, Tina had reacted to the news by being aggressive in her criticism of Fred. She held nothing back when it came to listing his faults as a father, a husband, and a human being. But even though the hatred Tina expressed was strong enough to constitute a possible motive for Fred's murder, Tina, who had been seen at her health clinic over the weekend, also had an alibi for the Friday night before Fred's murder and the Saturday morning when he was found dead by his neighbors. And both sisters pointed to alternative suspects that were much closer to 1515 Hearthglow Lane than Texas was. First on that list was Michael Jablin, the brother who stood to gain control of Fred's financial assets. And what about Fred's latest love interest? Had police interviewed Charlene yet? And finally, without providing any names, Piper also hinted darkly at enemies Fred had within the University of Richmond. And when Virginia investigators dug deeper into the money trail behind the passenger tickets belonging to the still unidentified person who traveled under the name Tina Roundtree, the case only got more confusing. The airplane tickets had been purchased by Piper's former boyfriend on a credit card he said he hadn't used in weeks and had assumed was lost. And when investigators in Richmond found a reservation under the name Tina Roundtree at a motel in Richmond for the night before Fred's murder, the name of the person who actually checked into that room showed up in the motel records as Geraldine Smith. And drifting in the background behind the Roundtree sisters, there was Tina's on-again, off-again boyfriend who had recently taken Piper off to a shooting range for some target practice. Meanwhile, both Piper and her sister Tina started ducking out on any more interviews with law enforcement. Instead, the two sisters checked into the expensive and stylish Houstonian Hotel in central Houston. The only thing Piper seemed to care about now was arranging a court hearing in Virginia to get custody of her 3 kids. And Tina, who had appointed herself as Piper's guardian and champion, was there to support Piper and keep the press and police at bay. So despite a promising start, 3 days after the Virginia police had arrived in Houston, Texas, progress into Fred Jablin's murder came to a stuttering halt. And even though detectives in Richmond had turned up some promising evidence, what police needed was someone who could positively identify the airline passenger who went by the name Tina Roundtree and then place that person in Richmond at the time of Fred's murder. And on Wednesday, November 3rd, 5 days after Fred Jablin was killed, police finally got the tip they needed to break the case. Based on an interview with a Southwest Airlines ticketing agent and the deconstruction of hundreds of cell phone calls placed during the days before and after Fred Jablin's death, here is a reconstruction of what happened outside of 1515 Hearthglow Lane on the morning of Saturday, October 30th, 2004. Anyone who knew Frederick Mark Jablin also knew he was a man who enjoyed his routines, especially after all the disruptions of the last 2 years. He found new meaning in simple pleasures, like getting up at the same time every morning, retrieving his newspaper from the side driveway, then enjoying a freshly brewed pot of coffee in his quiet kitchen. And on this Saturday, when Fred stepped outside dressed in his navy blue sweatpants, sweatshirt, and robe, he also enjoyed knowing that he and the kids could spend the day together, getting ready for Halloween. When he and Piper were together, it had been Fred who took the family pictures, even though it meant that he himself was rarely in any of them. This year, he would make sure to have his neighbors take pictures of him and the 3 kids. It had been a long haul getting through the divorce, but despite the painful memories that had preoccupied him last night during the Friday evening service at Temple Beth Ahaba, the fact was that Fred felt pretty good about his life and about his kids. He and Piper might not see eye to eye, and Fred doubted he'd ever fully trust his ex-wife again, but he knew she loved their kids as deeply as he did. As Fred headed slowly for the driveway, he could see the tall trees that ringed the big backyard and feel the chill air on his face and ankles. This time tomorrow, daylight savings time would come to an end and clocks would have been set back an hour. Instead of darkness, he'd be watching the sun rise. Still, he liked this feeling of being all alone, the only person awake and outside. Except that Fred was not alone. Standing quietly in the shadow on the far side of the garage, Fred's killer had felt their pulse quicken at the sound of the back door opening and then closing softly behind Fred. Now, the killer heard the slight rustle of leaves as Fred turned right out of the back kitchen door and began walking towards the open space between the house and the garage, which was set back even farther from the street than the house was. The newspaper lay neatly folded on the far side of the black Ford Explorer that was parked near the top of the driveway. The killer knew Fred would walk between the garage doors and around the front bumper of the vehicle to retrieve the paper. And when Fred did exactly that, the killer would be ready. Now adjusting their blue latex gloves, the killer took a slow, deliberate breath. The killer assumed the children were asleep in the house, but even if they were awake, or if they woke up, and even came down the stairs or looked out the bedroom windows, they wouldn't see anything. The killer would be gone, and Fred's body would be hidden from view by the big black car in the driveway. A moment later, the sound of rustling leaves gave way to the sound of slippers on pavement. But as Fred rounded the front bumper of his Ford Explorer, the garage doors on his left and the children's basketball hoop on the other side of the driveway facing him, he paused for a second before making another quarter turn to his right to scan the ground for the folded newspaper. At that moment, Fred's killer stepped out of their hiding place on the far side of the garage. This shot would not be fired at point-blank range, or even close enough to leave any gunpowder residue on Fred's sweatshirt or robe, but the killer would still hit their target. A moment later, as Fred straightened and began to turn back towards whatever he had just seen out of the corner of his eye, his killer pulled the trigger of the .38 caliber revolver loaded with its copper-jacketed hollow-point bullets. And as the sound of the shots died away, the killer watched as Fred crumpled to the ground. Reaching the pavement, Fred's body rolled so he lay face down but still partly on his side, his glasses landing a foot or so away from his face, his knees drawn up slightly towards his chest. Although neighbors would report hearing 3 gunshots, only 2 bullets hit their mark. The second shot entered the soft tissue of Fred's right arm back to front, the bullet traveling downward and missing any vital tissue. That was the bullet that would be recovered at the crime scene in just a few hours. It was the first shot that proved fatal. That type of bullet, designed to mushroom out upon impact so it did maximum internal damage, had entered from the back, striking Fred in the lower right side before ripping upward through his spleen, kidney, liver, diaphragm, and aorta, the main artery carrying blood away from the heart. By the time the first dogs in the neighborhood had started to bark, the killer was running across the neighbor's front lawn towards the darker shade of the trees that bordered each house lot. The medical examiner, who would later perform the autopsy on Fred's body, could not rule out the possibility that if Fred had been found immediately after that first 911 call at around 6:37 a.m., he might have survived his injuries. Still, the first medics on the scene an hour later had done everything they could. Despite not finding a pulse, they still turned Fred onto his back and cut away his shirt to inject heart-stimulating drugs and to perform CPR, but they were too late. Sometime between that first 911 call and the second 911 call more than an hour later, Fred had died of organ failure and massive internal bleeding. By the time police had covered Fred's body with a white sheet and escorted his terrified children out of the house, Fred's killer was already on the road, making the 2-hour drive south to Virginia's Norfolk International Airport. After returning their rented maroon minivan, Fred's killer made their way to the ticketing agent at Southwest Airlines. At 8:29 a.m., 2 hours after murdering Fred, the killer booked a flight first to Baltimore, 200 miles north, and then on from Baltimore to Houston, Texas. As Piper Roundtree handed the Southwest Airline ticketing agent her sister Tina's ID and the ticket Piper had bought using the credit card that she'd taken from her boyfriend, Jerry Walters, she made a quick adjustment to the blonde wig she was wearing over her dark brown hair, and she also made sure her sunglasses completely covered her brown eyes. A few minutes later, when Piper sat down in the waiting area until it was time to board her 12:30 a.m. flight back to Houston, she pulled out her cell phone and scrolled through the long list of calls she had made since arriving in Richmond 2 days earlier, on Thursday, October 28th. She was smart to have asked the receptionist at the motel in Richmond to change her name in the register from Tina Roundtree to Geraldine Smith, just one more way to throw police off her trail. And when the police did come to question her, she could honestly tell them that things with Fred were so much better now than they had been 2 years ago. But for Piper, her camping vacation earlier in the month with the kids had finally shown her that getting along better with Fred still wasn't enough. The person her children really needed wasn't their father, it was her, their mother. And soon enough, they would have her, and only her. As Piper tucked Tina's driver's license back inside her wallet, Piper looked closely at the small picture of her sister. Tina was a little taller and heavier, her hair was blonde and her eyes were a bright blue, but when Piper wore the wig and dark glasses, all people saw were the similarities in the sisters' faces and expressions and that wide, Roundtree smile. But it would turn out that Piper's disguise, like her alibi, was not quite as good as she thought it was. 5 days after Piper Roundtree killed the father of her 3 kids, Detective Kelly from Virginia knew that in order to solve this murder investigation, he needed to get a positive ID on Southwest Airlines passenger Tina Roundtree. So, on the afternoon of Wednesday, November 3rd, the same day that hundreds of people were attending Fred Jablin's funeral service back in Richmond, the investigator made one more trip back to Hobby Airport in Houston. He tracked down the name of the Southwest airline agent who had checked Tina Roundtree's ticket and luggage on her flight from Houston out to Richmond 1 week earlier on Thursday, October 28th. When he met Kathy Molly, the big detective from Virginia showed her Tina Roundtree's airline ticket and asked Kathy if she could remember anything about the passenger. A moment later, Kathy handed the ticket back with a friendly smile. "Yeah, I remember," she told the investigator. Kathy went on to say that the passenger was a very attractive woman, nicely dressed, but there was something else Kathy remembered too. The passenger was obviously wearing a blonde wig, and along with her suitcase, she was carrying a gun. And when Detective Kelly showed Kathy the pictures he now carried with him everywhere, one of Tina Roundtree and one of Piper Roundtree, Kathy didn't even hesitate before tapping the photo of Piper. "That's her," Kathy said. "That's the woman who checked the gun." On Monday, November 8th, 2004, 10 days after Fred was shot to death outside of his home on Hearthglow Lane, Henrico County Police charged his ex-wife, Piper Roundtree, with first-degree murder. Piper was arrested shortly after leaving a custody hearing in Virginia, at which Piper asked the court to grant her, and not Fred's brother Michael, custody of the 3 Roundtree Jablin children. In addition to having been identified as the passenger traveling to and from Richmond under the name Tina Roundtree, Piper's cell phone records had also placed her in and around Richmond from Thursday, October 28th through the morning of Saturday, October 30th, the morning of Fred's death. Even though Piper claimed that she and her sister Tina often used one another's cell phones, the phone that Piper used on Friday evening, the night before Fred was killed, to call her son Paxton and tell him she was in Texas, was the same cell phone that had pinged off cell phone towers in Richmond to connect that call to Paxton's cell phone. As for Piper's alibis, it would turn out that after checking credit card receipts, the man who had placed Piper in the Volcano Bar in Houston on that Friday night before Fred's murder had made a mistake. It had been Saturday night, after Piper had returned from Richmond, that she was seen at that bar. And although Piper's friend and former law colleague would insist to Virginia investigators that he had talked to Piper in Houston midday on Saturday before that Southwest flight from Baltimore arrived in Houston, it turned out that he had made an earlier statement to a reporter saying that the first time he had seen Piper in nearly a year was the day after Fred's murder, Sunday, October 31st, when she would have already been back in Houston for nearly 24 hours. On Saturday, February 26, 2005, 1 year and 4 months after Fred was murdered, a Virginia jury spent less than 1 hour in deliberations before coming back with a guilty verdict in the trial of Piper Roundtree. Her defense attorney argued, unsuccessfully, that the real murderer was Piper's sister, Tina, and when Piper herself took the stand, she implied the same thing, while at the same time insisting to the end that she herself had absolutely nothing to do with Fred's murder. When asked point blank if she wanted the jury to think her sister Tina committed the murder, Piper replied, "I have no idea what happened." Piper would use that same refrain when she was asked how her cell phone had appeared in Virginia in the days before and on the day of Fred's murder, or why she decided to brush up on her shooting skills the week before Fred's death, or why she had used her boyfriend's credit card to purchase a blonde wig, or how her black Liberty Jeep had wound up in the parking lot at the Hobby Airport in Houston from Thursday, October 28th to Saturday, October 30th, Piper told the jury she either had no idea how those things could have happened, or that they were just meaningless coincidences that had nothing to do with Fred's murder. 2.5 months later, on May 7th, 2005, Piper was sentenced to life in prison. Her first request for parole in 2020 was denied. She will be eligible for parole again in 2033 when she will be 72 years old. On Friday, November 4th, 2005, days before Piper's trial for murder, Piper's sister, Tina, pled guilty in a Houston courtroom to a charge related to Fred Japlin's murder, attempted tampering of evidence. Tina was fined $300 and sentenced to 80 hours of community service. Tina died in 2020. In 2006, a Virginia court granted full custody of Fred and Piper's 3 children to Fred's brother, Michael Jablin. We'd like to say a special thanks to author Catherine Casey, whose book, Die, My Love, a true story of revenge, murder, and 2 Texas sisters, was our main source in creating this podcast. Because Piper Roundtree has never admitted any guilt or involvement in the murder of Fred Jablin, we relied on the prosecution's evidence and theory of motive to create our reconstruction of this crime. If you're interested in finding out more, please see our source list for additional background and information.
On the morning of July 23, 2006, a 74-year-old artist named Maurice Agus paced back and forth near an art exhibit in Riverside Park in Chesterless Street, England. And Maurice was frustrated because this was supposed to be one of the biggest days of his entire 40-year career as an artist. Right now, his exhibit, his masterpiece, should be full of people, but it wasn't. So Maurice's exhibit was called Dream Space. It was this massive structure about half the size of a soccer field, and inside of it was the sprawling network of small, colorful, interconnected rooms. Dreamspace was designed so that visitors could sort of wander from room to room and be affected by the music and soothing lighting and have kind of an immersive, serene experience. And this was by far the largest physical exhibit that Maurice had ever done. So it had taken a lot of preparation, and naturally there had been some construction hiccups, but it was all going to be worth it because Maurice knew it was about to be seen by a lot of people, since it was located in a really big public park. However, before they could actually open, there was still one more hiccup to deal with. This morning, when Maurice had arrived, he'd realized that part of his exhibit had not been set up correctly. So he and his staff had spent the last few hours rushing around to fix everything and add some finishing touches to the exterior. And Maurice knew they really needed to hurry here, because making these changes had already taken up way too much time, and they were already late in opening the exhibit. Maurice could see that there were guests who had already purchased tickets who were lining up at the entrance to get into Dreamspace, and they looked confused and sort of annoyed about why they weren't inside already. And so naturally, Maurice was afraid that if he didn't wrap this up soon and start letting people in, these people would just start leaving, which meant they would not get to see how amazing his masterpiece was, and that would be just devastating. So at this point, Maurice just stepped back and he looked at what he and his staff had done so far in terms of fixes. And he decided that, things were looking good enough. They'd addressed the major issues that he had. And even though Maurice was ultimately a perfectionist and would have liked to do even more additions, just getting Dreamspace open at this point was way more important. So Maurice told his staff to stop what they were doing and go to the entrance and start letting the visitors in. A few hours later, around 3:15 p.m., 68-year-old Elizabeth Collings walked into Riverside Park with her 14-year-old grandson. They lived in the area, and they had just decided to take a walk together in the park. And Elizabeth was glad they had. It was like the perfect summer day. There was a light breeze. It was very sunny and warm. And so with the wind rustling her hair and her grandson happily walking beside her, she felt very at peace. But just then, her grandson stopped and sort of broke her peace by telling her to, "Hey, look at this." And Elizabeth turned and looked, where her grandson was pointing. And she saw on the other side of the park, there was this sprawling, colorful structure with a huge line of people out front and soothing music coming from its open doors. And Elizabeth thought, whatever that is, it looked really intriguing and not like anything she had ever seen before. So she was just excited as her grandson to go check it out. And so she said, let's go. Just a few minutes later, and Elizabeth and her grandson had purchased their tickets and actually stepped inside the exhibit. And Elizabeth knew instantly that this had been a great idea. The lights were dim inside, and the colorful walls seemed to almost glow as they went from room to room. And all around them, the dreamy, tranquil music played. And even though it was fairly crowded and pretty hot inside, it still felt quite peaceful. And Elizabeth could feel her entire body just sort of relax. And for the next 10 minutes or so, she and her grandson just wandered around slowly, taking in the atmosphere and the lights and the music. It was really nice. At some point, they made their way into this room which had this beautiful blue hue to it. And there was some light coming in from the room next to them, which was sort of brownish. And when the color of the room they were in and this brownish light combined, it sort of had this effect of making the room feel almost green, and then mixed with the music. It was just this really cool experience. And both Elizabeth and her grandson were just sort of transfixed, sort of taking in this really cool exhibit. But as they were taking this in, all of a sudden, there was this deafening snapping sound. And the moment that snapping sound happened, Elizabeth suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented, and as she stared at all the colors around her, the room seemed to almost tilt, and she found herself stumbling a few steps, like the room was moving and she was losing her balance. And at first she wondered if maybe the lights and the heat were just getting to her, except then she couldn't help but have this almost floating sensation, like the room itself was moving away from her. And then she realized her feet were no longer touching the floor. The creator of Dreamspace, Maurice, had been outside with the guests who were in line waiting to get into the exhibit. And so far, the day really had been going great. I mean, he had done all those last-minute changes and fixes to the exhibit, and he had sort of got it done just in time to open it up, and now all these people are here, and there's at least 40-some-odd people in line, with more and more joining, and everybody who comes out of the exhibit is, beaming and talking about what an incredible experience it was. I mean, the day had been going great for Maurice until he heard that snapping sound. When that loud snap rang out, everybody heard it, and then Maurice, who was looking away from Dreamspace, he began hearing screams behind him. And then before he could say or do anything, he just sort of whipped around and looked, and all he saw were these shapes just falling from the sky and smashing into the ground. And at first, Maurice and everybody else around him didn't even know what they were. Then suddenly Maurice realized those shapes were people. So earlier in the day, when Maurice and his staff were sort of hustling to get all those last-minute fixes done on this exhibit so they could open it to the public, well, Maurice, who knew this was going to be his last big art exhibit, this was like the end of his career, it was supposed to be the exclamation point on a storied career here, he was so worried that if he didn't get the doors open fast enough, that people in line were going to leave and not even show up, and it would be this catastrophic failure, that he ultimately basically stopped his staff from finishing all the renovations, all the fixes he needed to do, in favor of just getting people in the door. And the way he sort of rationalized it was, well, I'm a perfectionist, and I would have liked to have done all the fixes, but I did enough. It's good enough. Let's get this place open. Let's send people in. The problem with that is some of the things that he overlooked in his haste to open up the front doors for the public included vital safety precautions. Some of these missed safety precautions included tying down a series of extra ropes to anchor the exhibit to the ground. The staff had ultimately tied down the front of the structure, but, because Maurice rushed them to get the place open, they didn't anchor the back of the exhibit. And this would turn out to be just a catastrophic oversight. Dreamspace was not a regular permanent art exhibit. It was not made of walls and concrete with a real foundation. It was an inflatable exhibit made of plastic sheeting, sort of like what shower curtains are made of. So even though there was just a light breeze going through the park that day, it was enough to sort of suddenly lift the entire Dreamspace structure out of the ground, because again, there was just a couple of anchors, not a full set of anchors, and so suddenly the wind yanks the space out of the ground. That was the snapping sound, And so basically this big structure turned into like a giant hot air balloon, and everybody inside of it, the dozens of people, including Elizabeth and her grandson, were thrown 30 feet into the air. And they're all trapped inside of this plasticky structure that's contorting in the wind up at 30 feet. And as the wind picked up, the higher up they went, the dream space structure, as it contorted, began ejecting all of the people inside of it out. And so that's why when Maurice looked, he saw all these people falling to the ground. In the end, 27 people were injured and 2 were killed, including Elizabeth Collings. As for Maurice Agus, the creator of Dream Space, he was convicted of a health and safety violation and given a fine. But despite that being a relatively light punishment relative to what happened, he was so devastated by the destruction that his creation caused that he never made anything like it again. This was the last piece of art he ever did. And in fact, he died just 3 years later in 2009. On the afternoon of Friday, February 7th, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lejeune cleared the table after lunch at her house in Cologne, France. Her husband, Claude, and 2 of her adult sons, Franck and Pascal, were at the table. And while Monique cleaned up, the men talked over what they needed to pack for the overnight trip they were about to take. They were heading to a family gathering near Paris, about 3.5 hours away, to celebrate Claude's sister-in-law's retirement. Monique was not going to go, and she had told her family it was because somebody had to stay home with their 4 dogs. And that was true, but there also was another real reason why Monique did not want to be there. And it was because she just didn't get along very well with Claude's family. So Monique and Claude had gotten married almost 20 years earlier, but at the time they both already had multiple kids from previous marriages. Monique had 3 boys, and Claude had 5 girls. And for a while, the 2 halves of the blended family had gotten along quite well. But over time, there were some personality clashes between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. When Monique and Claude got married, all 5 girls were at least teenagers, if not in their 20s. And so while they sort of accepted Monique as being part of their lives, they just couldn't view her as an actual motherly figure. You know, they were already close with their actual mother, Claude's ex-wife Beatrice. And so that was their mother, and Monique was like the add-on. Then, in 1993, one of Claude's grandsons, so one of his daughter's children, had accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him, and that had completely ripped the family apart. Now, this was never reported to the police, so there was no actual investigation into whether this really happened or not. But Claude's 5 daughters and Claude's ex-wife Beatrice had fully believed the grandson. And Monique had defended her son, Jean-Luc, and Claude was kind of stuck in the middle of it. And it had gotten so ugly that the 2 sides of the family had just stopped talking to each other for a whole year. And so now the whole family was basically back on speaking terms as they were getting ready for this retirement party, but it was still extremely uncomfortable and tense. And so that is why Monique was not going to go, and also why her son, Jean-Luc, was not going to go as well. Finally, around 3 p.m., as Claude and the 2 sons wheeled their suitcases out to the car, Monique went to the front door and she said goodbye to them and then watched as they hopped in the car and drove off. A few hours later, around 6:30 p.m., Monique heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it, it was her son, Jean-Luc, and he was standing there holding up his bicycle. He told his mom he was just stopping by on his way home from work. And she said, "Great, come on in." And so Jean-Luc left his bike outside and he walked in, and as he was taking off his coat, he mentioned to his mother that her neighbor across the street, whose name was Henri, had clearly been watching Jean-Luc when he rolled up, like he was basically spying on him. And Monique actually kind of was spooked by that, because Henri was a bit of a loose cannon. For example, anytime anybody parked their car in front of Henri's house, he would shamelessly vandalize their vehicle by slashing their tires or pouring oil all over their car. I mean, the guy just didn't care. In fact, over the years, there had been several heated arguments between Monique and her sons and Henri about parking. And in fact, one of those arguments had even escalated into a physical fight. But since Jean-Luc had shown up tonight without a car, he rode his bike here, Monique just hoped that, whatever issues Henri had, that it wouldn't go anywhere, because there's no car in front of his property, like, we didn't do anything, leave us alone. Monique led her son into the kitchen, where she poured 2 glasses of sparkling wine, and then the two just sat there and chatted for about half an hour, and then Monique gave her son a haircut, and then around 7:05, Jean-Luc said goodbye to his mom. He went outside, hopped on his bike, which had not had its tires slashed by Henri, and he left to go to his apartment with his wife to have dinner. After Jean-Luc was gone, Monique just sort of went about her evening. She corralled the dogs behind a baby gate at the base of the stairs and then fed them, and then she went into the kitchen and began cooking dinner for herself. But then, a little while later, at around 7:30 p.m., Monique heard another knock on the door, and she knew it very likely was not her son, and so as she walked down the hallway to answer it, she just hoped it wasn't Henri. The following morning, the woman who lived next door to Monique woke up feeling pretty tired. She hadn't slept well because someone's dogs in the neighborhood had been barking all night. She got out of bed and walked over to the window and opened up the blinds, and as her eyes adjusted to the light that was flooding in, she looked down from her second-floor window into the yard of the 2-story white house that was next door, Monique's house. And the neighbor saw there was something dark in the middle of the walkway that led to the front door of Monique's house. And so the neighbor, she put her face right up to the window and she squinted to get a better look. And she realized what she was seeing was a body lying face down on the pavement. And so in a panic, this woman ran out of her room, grabbed the phone, and called the police. A couple hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Anne Preem pulled up in front of a white 2-story house with crime scene tape and a medical examiner's van right out front. As Preem got out of her car, a police officer walked over to her and led her to where the body of a woman was lying out in the front yard. The officer told Preem that the victim, Monique Lejeune, had been discovered exactly like this by her neighbors earlier that morning. And based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner estimated that Monique had likely died between 8 p.m. and midnight the night before. Preem bent down to get a better look at the body, but even before getting up close, she knew this woman had sustained just gruesome injuries. There was blood all over Monique's face and her clothes, and her torso appeared completely ripped apart by what appeared to be stab wounds. Preem guessed, just from looking at the scene, that this woman must have been murdered and likely was stabbed, just at first glance, at least a dozen times. Preem also noticed pretty obvious defense wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms, which certainly suggested again that she was murdered and that Monique had put up a pretty good fight against her killer. And so after a few more moments of just kind of looking over the body, Preem stood back up and asked the officer if the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And the officer said no, aside from the fact that Monique's dogs, she had 4 dogs, had been barking nonstop really the whole night, starting at around 8 p.m. Preem nodded and thanked the officer, and then she made her way over to the front door of the house to look to see if there was any signs of forced entry, as the door was closed. When she got there, she didn't see any signs, but she did see a bloody handprint on the outside wall near the door. And then, when Preem turned the handle of the door and opened it up, she saw this hallway inside that was absolutely covered in blood. And so Preem very carefully stepped inside, trying to avoid stepping in the blood or tracking any prints anywhere. And she began walking down the hallway very carefully and looking in other rooms. And she saw that for the most part, the blood spatter was pretty well contained in the entryway, which told her that the attack on Monique likely began and ended in the entryway. And so her running theory was, okay, Monique must have had someone come to the door, they knocked or whatever, and then Monique opened the door and was attacked immediately. But then, as Preem stepped back outside, she looked down at the front walkway and noticed something kind of unusual. Despite all the blood right inside the front door, there was no blood at all on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. And just from the amount of blood that the victim had clearly lost inside the house, Preem doubted that she would have been capable of running out into the yard after the attack. So she had to wonder if maybe the body had been moved post-mortem. And Monique was a large woman, so if her killer had been able to overpower her, one, and then also move her body such a far distance after she was dead, Preem assumed that whoever her killer was likely pretty strong. In fact, Preem just kind of assumed that the killer had to be a big, strong man. However, What Preem didn't understand was why would the killer want to drag a corpse out into the yard where the neighbors could see them? Unless, for some reason, they wanted Monique to be found as soon as possible. And since, at least at this point, it appeared like Monique likely had gone to the front door and opened the door for her killer, Preem thought that the killer must be someone that she knew.